Welcome to NightSleepWhisper. Tonight, we leave the loud world behind and journey into the peaceful and mysterious streets of Blackwood. Before we begin our 50-chapter saga, The Mystery of the Thorn Bookstore, find your most comfortable position and take a deep breath. Dusty shelves, ancient secrets, and Sarah's story await you. Close your eyes. Our journey begins now. Sarah stood on the sidewalk and looked at the building. It was a small building with 2 floors. The first floor was the bookstore. The second floor was her new home. The paint on the walls was a pale blue color, but it was old and falling off in some places. Above the door, there was a wooden sign. It said The Book Haven. The letters were faded and hard to read, but Sarah liked them. Sarah was 45 years old. For 20 years, she worked as a history teacher in a very loud and busy city. She liked her students, but she was always tired. The city was too fast. She wanted a place where the only sound was the turning of pages. She wanted to live in a village where life was slow. She wanted to be the woman who owned the local bookstore. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a heavy iron key. It felt cold and solid in her hand. She put the key into the lock. It was difficult to turn at first because the lock was old and rusty. She had to use both hands. She pushed the door with her shoulder. The door opened. Inside, the air was very still. It smelled like dust and dried ink. Sarah walked into the middle of the room. Sunlight came through the dirty windows in long, thin lines. She could see tiny pieces of dust dancing in the light. There were tall wooden shelves against every wall. Thousands of books sat on the shelves. Some were thick and bound in leather. Others were small and had colorful covers. They were all covered in a gray layer of dust. "This is mine now," Sarah said quietly. Her voice sounded strange in the empty room. It was a soft sound that did not travel far. She walked to the back of the shop. There was a small counter where the old owner used to stand. There was an old cash register on the counter. It was made of heavy, black metal. Behind the counter, there was a small door. Sarah opened it and found a tiny kitchen and a staircase. Everything was very old, but she did not mind. She liked the history of the building. She felt a little overwhelmed. There was so much work to do. She needed to clean the floors, wash the windows, and organize all the books. She wondered about the man who lived here before. His name was Thomas. People said he just walked away one day and never came back. Sarah went back to the front door and looked out at the street. The village was very quiet. The road was made of gray stones. Across the street, there was a small bakery and a park with large oak trees. No one was walking outside. It felt like the village was sleeping. Sarah took a deep breath. She went to her car and started to carry her boxes inside. She was ready to begin. She did not know that the bookstore held a secret. She only knew that she was finally home. Sarah spent the entire morning moving boxes from her car into the bookstore. The sun was high in the sky, and the air was getting warm. She carried a heavy box of kitchen supplies toward the front door. Her arms felt tired, and her face was red from the work. Every time she walked into the shop, she smelled the old paper and the dry wood. The boxes were filled with her life from the city. She had boxes of clothes, boxes of dishes, and many boxes of her own favorite books. She put the boxes in a small pile near the back of the room. The wooden floor made a low sound every time she moved her feet. It was a very old floor. In the afternoon, Sarah decided to start cleaning. She could not put her things away because the shelves were too dirty. She found a bucket and a mop in the small kitchen. She filled the bucket with warm water and soap. She took a soft white cloth and began to wipe the first shelf near the window. When she touched the shelf, a thick cloud of dust rose into the air. Sarah had to turn her head away. She waited a moment for the air to become clear again. The dust was everywhere. It was on the books, on the floor, and even on the light bulbs hanging from the ceiling. She worked slowly and carefully. She cleaned one shelf, then another. After an hour, the wood began to look beautiful again. The wood was a dark, rich brown color. As she cleaned, Sarah looked at the books on the shelves. She did not recognize many of the titles. Most of the books were very old. Some were about history, and some were about gardening. She found a large book about the stars. It had a beautiful blue cover with gold letters. She opened it and saw a name written on the first page. Thomas Thorne. So, that was his full name. Sarah thought. She wondered what kind of man Thomas was. The village people did not talk much about him. They only said he was a quiet man who loved his books. By 5 o'clock in the evening, Sarah was very tired. Her back hurt, and her hands were dirty. She sat down on one of her boxes and looked around the shop. Half of the shelves were now clean. The windows were still dirty, but the shop looked a little better. She felt a small sense of pride. This was a lot of work, but it was her work. She stood up and walked to the front window. She looked at the street again. A man was walking a dog on the other side of the road. He wore a long brown coat and a hat. He stopped for a moment and looked at the bookstore. He did not wave or smile. He just looked at the building for a few seconds and then continued walking. Sarah felt a small chill, though the room was not cold. She shook her head. "I'm just tired," she told herself. She went to the kitchen to make a cup of tea. She needed to rest before the sun went down. Sarah finished her cup of tea. She sat on a wooden chair and looked at the clean shelves. The sun was starting to set. The light in the shop was turning orange and gold. It was a beautiful sight, but the shadows in the corners were getting longer. Sarah felt a little lonely in the big, old building. She was not used to the silence of the village yet. Suddenly, the front door opened. A small metal bell above the door made a sharp, clear sound. Sarah jumped a little because she did not expect anyone. A man walked into the shop. He was the same man Sarah saw from the window earlier in the day. He was tall and wore a long, dark brown coat. He carried a black hat in his hands. The man had a thin face and very bright, gray eyes. He looked around the shop very carefully. He looked at the ceiling and then at the corners of the room. He did not look at the books first. He looked at the building itself, as if he was searching for a hole in the wall. "Good evening," the man said. His voice was very deep and very slow. He sounded like a man who thought about every word before he spoke. "Hello," Sarah said. She stood up and moved toward him. "The shop is not open yet. I'm still moving in and cleaning the shelves. I hope to open in 2 weeks." The man walked toward the wooden counter. He did not stop until he was very close to Sarah. "I'm not here to buy a book today," he said. "My name is Mr. Miller. I live in the house at the end of the street. I knew the man who lived here before you. His name was Thomas." "Oh," Sarah said. She felt a bit curious. "Was he a friend of yours?" Mr. Miller nodded slowly. "We talked often. He was a man who liked history. He liked old things. He spent a lot of time in this shop, even when it was closed. He was always looking for something." Sarah looked at the shelves. "I found a book with his name in it today. Thomas Thorne. He had a lot of books about the stars." Mr. Miller's eyes moved quickly to the book Sarah was talking about. Then he looked back at her. "Did you find anything else?" he asked. His voice was a whisper now. "Anything unusual? Perhaps something hidden or something that looked out of place?" Sarah felt a small knot of worry in her stomach. Mr. Miller's eyes were very serious. "No," she said. "I only found dust and old books. Why do you ask? Is something missing?" Mr. Miller did not answer her question immediately. He looked at the wooden floor. He tapped his heavy shoe on a floorboard. "This is a very old building, Sarah," he said quietly. "It was built a long time ago. Old buildings often have secrets. Thomas was looking for something important. I think he found it before he left." "What did he find?" Sarah asked. "I do not know," Mr. Miller said. He put his hat back on his head. He looked at Sarah one last time. "But be careful. Sometimes, when you look for the past looks back at you. If you find something strange, do not tell everyone. Some people in this village do not like secrets." He turned and walked to the door. The bell made a sound again as he left. Sarah watched him through the window as he walked away into the shadows of the evening. She went to the door and turned the lock. She felt a strange urge to check the floorboards under her feet. After Mr. Miller left, the shop felt different. Sarah looked at the floor and the walls. She thought about his words. What was Thomas looking for? Why was the past dangerous? She tried to shake the thoughts away. She told herself that Mr. Miller was just an eccentric man who liked mysteries. Still, she checked the lock on the front door one more time. She went to the back room behind the counter. This room was small and had no windows. It was very dark, so she turned on a small lamp. This was the place where Thomas probably kept his most important papers or did his office work. There was a small desk and a chair, but they were empty. Sarah took her broom and began to sweep the floor. The floor in this room was made of thick, heavy planks of oak wood. Most of the planks were tight and did not move. However, when she reached the corner near the back door, the broom made a hollow sound. It was not a solid sound like the rest of the floor. She stopped sweeping. She knelt down on the floor. Her knees felt the cold, hard wood. She used her fingers to touch the floorboards. She pushed on one, then another. Finally, she found it. One board near the wall was not nailed down. It sat a few millimeters higher than the others. Sarah felt a jump in her chest. She was nervous, but she was also very curious. She went to her toolbox in the kitchen and grabbed a flat screwdriver. She came back to the corner and put the metal tip of the screwdriver into the thin crack between the boards. She pushed down on the screwdriver. The wood moved. She pulled harder. The board was heavy, but it began to lift. Sarah used her hands to pull the piece of wood up and away. She set it on the floor next to her. Under the floorboard, there was a small, square hole. It was filled with dust and spiderwebs. Sarah reached her hand into the dark space. Her fingers touched something soft and cold. She pulled it out. It was a small bundle wrapped in a piece of grey cloth. She sat on the floor and carefully unwrapped the cloth. Inside, there was a small book. It had a dark red cover made of leather. The leather was old and had many scratches. There was no title on the front and no name on the back. Sarah opened the book to the first page. The paper was yellow and smelled like old vinegar. The handwriting was small and very neat. It was a diary. She looked at the first date written at the top of the page. It was from 10 years ago. She held the diary tightly. Her hands were shaking just a little bit. She knew she should probably stop and go to sleep, but she could not. She felt like she was holding a secret in her hands. Thomas Thorne did not just leave his books behind. He left his thoughts. Sarah sat in the quiet room for a long time. The lamp cast a long shadow of her on the wall. She looked at the red diary and wondered if this was what Mr. Miller was talking about. She decided to read the first entry. Sarah sat on the floor with the red book in her lap. The lamp on the desk was the only light in the room. The rest of the bookstore was dark and full of shadows. She carefully opened the first page. The ink was dark, but some parts were faded. The date at the top was April 12th. 10 years ago. My name is Thomas Thorne. The first line said, I am writing this because I am afraid. I love this village, but something is wrong here. I think I found a secret that was better left alone. Sarah felt a chill on her neck. She pulled her sweater tighter around her shoulders. She read the next few sentences. Thomas wrote about his daily life in the shop. He talked about the books he sold and the tea he drank. But as she turned the pages, the tone of the writing changed. He began to write about a man he called the mayor. The mayor came to the shop today. Thomas wrote on a page from May. He did not want to buy a book. He wanted to talk about the land under the building. He asked if I ever went into the basement. He looked very angry when I told him I liked to explore the old stone walls. Sarah looked toward the small door that led to the basement. She had not gone down there yet. She was too busy cleaning the main shop. Now, she felt a strange fear of the stairs. She looked back at the diary. I'm being watched. A later entry said, a man in a brown coat stands across the street every night. I think it is Miller, but I am not sure. Someone wants the map I found. They think it is here, in the shop. Sarah thought about Mr. Miller. He had visited her today. He had asked if she found anything unusual. Was he the man in the brown coat? Was he the person Thomas was afraid of? Or was Mr. Miller trying to help her? There were too many questions and not enough answers. She turned more pages. Some pages were covered in drawings. There were sketches of the village square, the old well, and the church. One drawing showed a path that went under the ground. Next to the drawing, Thomas wrote, the gold is not the only thing they are hiding. They are hiding the truth about the fire of 1920. Sarah did not know about a fire. She was new to the village. She wanted to keep reading, but her eyes were tired. The words started to blur together. She looked at the back of the diary. She saw that the very last pages were missing. They were not just empty. They were torn out. The edges of the paper were jagged and sharp. Someone took the end of the story. Sarah whispered. She stood up and put the red diary back into the hole under the floor. She placed the wooden board over it and moved a heavy box on top. She did not want anyone to find it. She walked to the front of the shop and looked through the window. The street was empty and silent. The moon was high and bright. Sarah went upstairs to her small apartment. She locked the door and lay down on her bed. She closed her eyes, but she could not sleep. She kept thinking about the fire, the mayor, and the man named Thomas who disappeared. She was no longer just a bookstore owner. She was part of a mystery. The next morning, the sun was bright, but the air was still cold. Sarah woke up early. She could not stop thinking about the red book. She went downstairs to the back room of the bookstore. She moved the heavy box and lifted the wooden board again. She took the diary and sat at her small desk. She opened the book to the very first page. She wanted to read it more carefully this time. The first entry was dated 10 years ago, on a rainy Monday. Thomas wrote about a walk he took through the village. He wrote that he saw something strange near the village clock tower. It was midnight. The diary said, the village was dark. I was walking home from the shop. I saw two men standing near the base of the clock tower. One man was the mayor. The other man was a stranger. They were talking in low voices. They held a large, heavy bag. The mayor looked very nervous. He kept looking around the square. Sarah looked out her window. She could see the top of the clock tower from the bookstore. It was a tall, stone building in the middle of the village square. It was very old and had a large, white clock face. The people of the village were proud of it. But according to Thomas, it was a place for secret meetings. I stayed in the shadows. The diary continued. I did not want them to see me. The mayor gave the bag to the stranger. Then, the stranger gave the mayor a small, silver key. They did not say a word. The stranger walked away toward the forest, and the mayor went into the town hall. I felt a cold fear in my heart. Why was the mayor meeting a stranger in the middle of the night? What was in the bag? Sarah put the diary down. Her heart was beating fast. She felt like she was watching the scene through Thomas's eyes. She wondered about the silver key. Was it the same key she saw in her dream, or was there a real key hidden somewhere else? She decided to go to the village square. She wanted to see the clock tower for herself. She put on her coat and walked out of the shop. The village was busy now. People were walking to the bakery. A woman was cleaning the windows of the pharmacy. It looked like a normal, peaceful place. Sarah reached the clock tower. It was even bigger when she stood next to it. The stone was rough and grey. There was a heavy wooden door at the bottom of the tower, but it was locked. She walked around the base of the tower. She looked for anything unusual. She saw a small mark on one of the stones near the ground. It was a small drawing of a star. It looked very old. "What are you looking for?" a voice asked. Sarah turned around quickly. It was the mayor, Mr. Black. He was a large man with white hair and a very bright smile. He wore a grey suit and held a leather briefcase. His eyes were very sharp. He did not look like a man who was afraid. He looked like a man who was in control. Sarah felt her heart beat faster. She tried to smile back. "I'm just looking at the architecture. It is a very beautiful tower," she said. She hoped her voice did not shake. Mr. Black smiled. His teeth were very white and perfectly straight. "It is the heart of our village," he said. "But you look a little cold." "Sarah. May I call you Sarah? Come, let us go to the cafe across the street. I want to welcome you to our community properly." They walked together to a small cafe called the Village Hearth. Inside, the air was warm and smelled like toasted bread and sweet coffee. There were several villagers sitting at small, round tables. When the mayor entered, the room became very quiet. The people watched Sarah with curious and tired eyes. The mayor ordered 2 large coffees. He sat across from Sarah and placed his leather briefcase on an empty chair. "So," he began, leaning toward her, "how is the bookstore?" Thomas was a very interesting man. He kept many things in that shop. "I hope you did not find it in too much of a mess." Sarah took a sip of her coffee. It was very hot and bitter. "It is very dusty," she said simply. "I am cleaning it one room at a time. It is a lot of work." The mayor leaned closer. The smile stayed on his face, but his eyes did not look happy. They were sharp and cold. "Did you find any old papers or documents?" Thomas sometimes forgot where he put his business records. "I was a close friend of his. I want to make sure the shop's history is kept safe." Sarah thought about the red diary hidden under the floorboards. She thought about the map and the notes about the secret meetings. She felt a cold shiver go down her back. "No," she said, looking him in the eyes. "I only found old books about gardening and the stars. I have not found any papers yet." The mayor watched her for a long moment. He did not blink. "I see," he said quietly. "Well, if you find any old folders, letters, or maps, please let me know immediately. It is very important for the village archives. We like to keep our records perfect." He stood up and adjusted his suit. "Welcome to our village, Sarah. I hope you stay for a long time. But remember, this is a very small place. We all look out for each other here. Everyone knows everything." He walked out of the cafe without looking back. Sarah sat alone at the table. Her hands were cold despite the warm coffee cup. She realized that the mayor was not just a friendly neighbor. He was searching for something, and he was worried that she might find it first. She needed to go back to the shop and read more of the diary. She felt like someone was watching her from the window of the town hall. Sarah walked back to the bookstore quickly. She did not look at the shops or the people. She felt the mayor's eyes on her back, even though he was not there. She reached her shop and went inside. She locked the door and pulled the curtains over the front windows. The shop was dark now, but she felt safer. She went to the back room and moved the heavy box again. She lifted the floorboard and took out the red diary. She sat at her desk and turned the pages. She wanted to find the exact place where the story changed. She read through the entries from the summer. Thomas wrote about the heat and the quiet village. But then, she reached the month of October. The last full entry was dated October 14th. In this entry, Thomas sounded very excited. "I found it." Thomas wrote, "The entrance is not in the cellar. It is much closer than I thought. I have the map now, and I know where the path leads. Tomorrow, I will go down and see the truth for myself. If I am right, the mayor will have to leave this village forever." Sarah turned the page, but there was no October 15th. The next page was dated December 1st. Between these two dates, there was a large gap. Sarah looked at the center of the book. She saw the jagged edges of paper. Several pages were missing. Someone had pulled them out with a lot of force. Who did this? Sarah whispered. Was it Thomas? Or was it someone else? She looked closely at the binding of the book. The person who took the pages was in a hurry. A very small piece of paper was still stuck in the spine of the diary. It was only a tiny corner of a page. Sarah used her fingernails to pull it out carefully. There was only one word written on the scrap of paper. The word was vault. Under the word, there was a small number. 1920. Sarah remembered the fire Thomas mentioned in an earlier entry. The fire of 1920. Now she had the word vault. She thought about the village history. A vault was a place to keep gold or important documents. Was there a vault under the village? Was that what the mayor was hiding? She felt a mix of fear and excitement. The missing pages were the most important part of the diary. They contained the location of the entrance and the truth about the mayor's crimes. Without those pages, she only had a small clue. She stood up and walked around the room. She looked at the floor, the walls, and the ceiling. Thomas said the entrance was much closer than I thought. If it was not in the cellar, where could it be? She looked at the heavy wooden shelves. She looked at the old fireplace. The mystery was growing. Sarah knew she was in danger, but she could not stop now. She had to find the missing information. She decided to go to the village archive the next day. Maybe she could find a map from 1920. Night fell over the village. Sarah was in her small apartment above the bookstore. She tried to relax, but it was difficult. She made a simple dinner of bread and cheese, but she was not very hungry. Every time the wind blew against the building, she looked at the door. She felt like the walls of the old house were listening to her. She sat on her sofa and picked up a book, but she did not read it. Her mind was full of thoughts about Thomas Thorne and the mayor. She thought about the word vault and the year 1920. The village seemed so quiet on the outside, but she knew there were dark secrets under the ground. The apartment was dark. Sarah only had one small lamp turned on. She liked the soft light, but it made the rest of the room look full of shadows. Suddenly, she felt a strange sensation. It was a feeling of being watched. She turned her head and looked toward the large window that faced the street. The street lights in the village were old and dim. They cast a pale yellow glow on the road. At first, Sarah saw nothing. Then, she saw a movement. A tall, dark shape was standing on the sidewalk across the street. The person was not moving. They were just standing there, looking up at her window. Sarah froze. Her heart started to beat very fast. She stayed very still in the dark. She did not want the person to know she was watching. The person wore a long coat and a hat that covered their face. It looked like the man she had seen before, but it was hard to be sure in the dark. Then, the person moved. They crossed the street and walked toward the bookstore. Sarah held her breath. She heard a soft, scraping noise against the glass of the front door downstairs. It was a quiet sound, like someone was trying to turn the handle or feel the lock. Sarah stood up slowly. She did not turn on any more lights. She walked to the window and looked down. She saw the top of the person's hat. The person stopped and looked up again. For 1 second, Sarah saw a flash of light on a pair of glasses. The person saw her. Immediately, the shadow turned and began to run. The person moved very quickly for a tall man. They ran down the narrow street and disappeared around the corner near the church. Sarah watched until she could not see them anymore. The street was empty again. She went to her front door and checked the lock 3 times. She felt cold and her hands were shaking. Was it Mr. Miller? Was it one of the mayor's men? She did not know. Someone knew she had the diary, or at least they were worried about what she was doing. She did not go to bed for a long time. She sat in a chair near the window and watched the street. She realized that the bookstore was no longer a safe place. The mystery was not just in the past. The mystery was happening now, and she was in the middle of it. The rest of the night was very long. Sarah did not sleep. She sat in the dark and listened to the house. Every small noise made her heart jump. The wind moved the branches of the trees, and the old wood of the floor made quiet, stretching sounds. She waited for the morning sun to arrive. When the sky finally turned light gray, Sarah felt a little better. She went downstairs to the back room. She did not open the shop. She did not want to see any customers yet. She wanted to look at the red diary one more time. She felt like she was missing something important. She sat at the desk and turned the diary over. She looked at the back cover. It was made of thick, dark leather. She ran her fingers over the surface. The leather felt smooth, but she noticed a small, hard bump near the bottom corner. It was very small, like a tiny stone under the skin. Sarah picked up a small letter opener from the desk. She carefully pushed the tip of the metal tool into the edge of the leather cover. She was very gentle. She did not want to ruin the old book. The glue was old and dry. With a slow movement, she peeled back a small piece of the inner lining. Something shiny fell out of the cover and hit the wooden desk. Sarah picked it up. It was a small silver key. The key was beautiful and very old. It was not like a modern key. It had a round top with a small star shape carved into the middle. The bottom of the key had 3 small teeth. It was very clean and did not have any rust. The silver key. Sarah whispered. She remembered the entry in the diary. Thomas wrote about the mayor receiving a silver key from a stranger near the clock tower. Was this the same key? If it was, how did Thomas get it? Did he steal it from the mayor, or did someone give it to him? She held the key in her hand. It felt heavy and cold. She thought about the word vault and the year 1920. She looked around the room. She looked at the walls of the bookstore. Thomas said the entrance was much closer than I thought. Could the lock for this key be inside the shop? She looked at the key again. The star shape on the top was very familiar. She remembered the stone at the base of the clock tower. It had the same star shape. She realized that the key and the village buildings were connected. Sarah put the key in her pocket. She felt a new sense of purpose. She was not just a teacher or a shop owner anymore. She was a detective. She needed to find the lock that this key opened. But she had to be careful. The shadow at the window proved that someone was watching her. They wanted this key, and they were willing to wait in the dark for it. She stood up and looked at the back door. She decided it was time to explore the one place she had avoided, the basement. Sarah decided to wait before going into the basement. She wanted more information first. She put on her coat and walked to the village library. The library was a tall building made of red brick. It stood next to the town hall. The windows were narrow and high. It looked more like a prison than a place for books. Inside, the air was cold. The library was very quiet. There were no people reading at the tables. An old woman sat behind a high wooden desk. She had grey hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her glasses hung from a silver chain around her neck. This was Mrs. Gable, the librarian. "Good morning," Sarah said softly. Mrs. Gable looked up. She did not smile. She looked at Sarah for a long time. "You are the new woman from the bookstore," she said. It was not a question. "I heard you were cleaning the place." "Yes," Sarah replied. "I am Sarah. I am interested in the history of the village. I want to read about the Great Fire of 1920. Do you have old newspapers or records from that time?" The librarian froze. She put her pen down on the desk. The room felt even colder than before. "Why do you want to know about that?" she asked. Her voice was very quiet. "That was a long time ago. It was a sad time for our village. We do not talk about it much." "I am a history teacher," Sarah said. It was a half-truth. "I like to learn about the places where I live. I also want to know about the previous owner of my shop, Thomas Thorne. Did he come here often?" At the mention of Thomas, Mrs. Gable's hands began to shake. She looked around the empty library as if she was afraid someone was listening. Mr. Thorne was a regular visitor. She whispered. He spent many hours in the basement of this library. He was looking at the old maps of the village. He was a very obsessed man. "Obsessed with what?" Sarah asked. Mrs. Gable leaned forward. "With the things that are buried," she said. He believed the fire of 1920 was not an accident. He believed it was started to hide something. But he stopped coming here a year ago. Then he simply vanished. Sarah felt a heavy weight in her chest. "Can I see the maps he was looking at?" The librarian hesitated. She looked at the door of the library. Then she sighed. "Follow me," she said. She led Sarah to a small, dark room at the back of the building. There were rows of metal cabinets filled with old papers. Mrs. Gable opened a drawer and pulled out a large, yellowed map. "This is the village from 1920, she said. "And here is the newspaper from the day after the fire." Sarah looked at the newspaper. The headline was large and black. "Tragedy at the Square." There was a photograph of the clock tower surrounded by smoke. Under the photograph, a small article caught her eye. It mentioned that the village gold fund, kept in a vault under the square, was lost in the heat. "Thomas found something on this map," Mrs. Gable said, pointing to a faint pencil mark near the bookstore. "But I do not know what it means." "Be careful, Sarah. Some stories are better left in the dust." Sarah looked closely at the yellow map. The paper felt thin and dry under her fingers. She followed the pencil lines that Thomas had drawn. They were faint, but she could see them clearly. One line started at the bookstore. It moved across the street, under the bakery, and stopped exactly at the base of the clock tower. There was another line that went from the clock tower to the village church. He was looking for a path. Sarah whispered to herself. Mrs. Gable stood near the door of the archive room. She held her arms tight against her body. She looked at the clock on the wall and then at the window. She seemed very eager for Sarah to leave. The air in the room felt heavy and cold. "Why did he mark the church?" Sarah asked, pointing to the map. Mrs. Gable shook her head quickly. "I do not know. Mr. Thorne did not share his thoughts with me. He only asked for the maps. He was a very quiet man, as I told you." Sarah turned to the librarian. "The newspaper says the gold was lost in the fire. But if the vault was under the square, it was made of stone and metal. How can gold be lost in a fire? It does not disappear. It melts, but it stays there." The librarian's face turned very pale. She looked away from Sarah. The fire was very hot. She said. Her voice was flat and lacked emotion. The building above the vault collapsed. Everything was buried under tons of hot stone and ash. The mayor at that time said it was too dangerous to dig. So, the vault was sealed forever. The mayor at that time. Sarah repeated. "Was that a member of the Black family?" Mrs. Gable hesitated. She twisted the silver chain of her glasses around her finger. "Yes," she said finally. "It was the current mayor's grandfather. The Black family has looked after this village for 100 years. They are very important people here. You should remember that." Sarah. The warning was clear. The librarian was telling her to stop asking questions about the mayor's family. Sarah felt a sense of frustration. She knew the librarian knew more than she was saying. She looked at the old woman's eyes. They were filled with a mix of sadness and deep fear. "Did Thomas Thorne find something that frightened you, Mrs. Gable?" Sarah asked softly. The librarian stepped back. Her shoes made a sharp, clicking sound on the hard floor. "I think you should go now," she said. "I have a lot of work to do, and the library is closing for lunch. Please leave the map on the table." Sarah knew she could not push any further. She folded her own notebook and put it in her bag. She looked at the pencil marks on the map one last time. She memorized the shape of the lines. "Thank you for your help," Sarah said. Mrs. Gable did not answer. She stood by the door and waited for Sarah to walk past her. As Sarah left the room, she heard the heavy wooden door shut with a solid, final thud. The sound echoed through the empty hallway. Sarah walked out into the bright daylight, but she did not feel warm. The conversation had been as cold as the basement air. She knew the librarian was afraid of the mayor, and now, Sarah was beginning to understand why. Sarah walked back to the bookstore from the library. The afternoon sun was bright, but the wind felt cold on her face. She kept her head down and moved quickly. She did not want to see the mayor or Mr. Miller again. When she reached the shop, she did not go inside immediately. Instead, she walked around the side of the building. The bookstore was connected to a small piece of land. It was surrounded by a high wall made of grey stones. Most people only saw the front of the shop, but Sarah wanted to see what was behind it. The side path was very narrow. It was filled with tall grass and dry bushes. It looked like no one had walked there for many years. She walked to the very back of the property. The stone wall was covered in thick, green ivy. The leaves were dark and grew over everything. Sarah noticed that the ivy was especially thick in one corner. She reached out and pushed the leaves aside. Her hands felt the cold, wet texture of the plants. Behind the ivy, she found a small metal gate. It was painted black, but the paint was old and falling off. In the center of the gate, there was a metal plate. Sarah cleaned the dirt off the plate with her sleeve. She gasped. In the middle of the plate was a carved star. It was the exact same shape as the one on her silver key, and the one at the base of the clock tower. Sarah felt her heart race. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver key. Her fingers were cold, and she held the key tightly so she would not drop it. She looked at the lock on the gate. It was covered in orange rust. She was not sure if the key would even turn. She put the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. She took a deep breath and turned the key to the right. At first, it did not move. She used more strength. The metal inside the lock made a dry, scraping noise. Then, there was a solid, heavy feeling of movement. The lock opened. Sarah pushed the gate. It was very heavy, and the hinges made a high, complaining sound because they were so dry. She stepped through the gate and found herself in a small, hidden garden. The garden was beautiful in a sad way. It was completely enclosed by high stone walls. There were old rose bushes that had no flowers, only long thorns. A stone bench sat in the middle of the garden, covered in green moss. The ground was covered in brown leaves that moved in the wind with a soft, rustling sound. Sarah looked around. This place was a secret. From the street, no one could see this garden. It was a private world. She walked to the center of the garden and looked at the back wall of her bookstore. There was no door here, but she saw something else. Near the ground, hidden behind a large pile of stones, there was a small wooden door. It was much smaller than a normal door. It looked like the entrance to a cellar or a crawl space. Sarah felt a shiver of excitement. Thomas Thorne had written that the entrance was much closer than I thought. She stood in the silent garden and looked at the small door. She knew that the silver key had opened the gate. But what was behind the wooden door? She needed a flashlight, and a lot of courage. Sarah went back inside the bookstore. She needed a light. She found a heavy black flashlight in a drawer in the kitchen. She checked the batteries. The light was bright and strong. She felt a little more brave with the light in her hand. She also took a pair of thick work gloves. She did not know what was behind that small door, and she wanted to be ready. She walked back through the shop and out to the side path. She entered the hidden garden again. The sun was lower now, and the shadows of the high stone walls were long. The garden felt even more secret than before. Sarah walked to the corner where the small wooden door was hidden. She put on her gloves and reached for the door handle. It was a simple iron ring. She pulled it, but the door did not move. It was stuck because of the dirt and the old wood. Sarah pulled again, using the strength in her legs. The door moved a few centimeters. A cloud of dry dirt fell from the top. She gave one final, hard pull. The door opened with a heavy, dragging sound against the earth. Sarah knelt down and shined her flashlight into the opening. It was not a small crawl space. It was the beginning of a narrow tunnel. The floor was made of flat, grey stones. The walls were made of the same stone as the garden walls. The ceiling was low, so she had to bend her back to see inside. She stepped into the opening. The air inside was very different. It was cool and smelled like wet earth and very old smoke. The stone path went straight for a few meters and then turned to the left. Sarah moved slowly. Her flashlight moved across the walls. She saw that the stones were very carefully placed. This was not a natural cave. People built this path a long time ago. She walked further into the tunnel. The sound of her shoes on the stone path was the only thing she could hear. It was a very lonely sound. After the turn, she saw something on the floor. She stopped and pointed her light at it. It was a small, wooden stool. Next to the stool, there was an empty glass bottle and a box of matches. Sarah touched the stool. It was not very dusty. This meant someone was here recently. She looked at the floor around the stool. In the thin layer of dust on the stones, she saw footprints. They were large footprints from a man's boots. They led deeper into the dark. Thomas. Sarah whispered. She was sure these were his tracks. He sat here. He watched. He waited. She followed the stone path as it began to go down. The air became colder. She saw a mark on the wall. It was a small arrow drawn in white chalk. It pointed deeper into the ground. Sarah felt a moment of fear. She was deep under her own bookstore now. No one knew she was here. If the door closed, she would be trapped in the dark. But her curiosity was stronger than her fear. She wanted to know where the stone path led. She thought about the map in the library. This path was going toward the center of the village. She kept walking, her flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. Sarah continued to walk through the narrow stone tunnel. Her flashlight created a bright circle of light on the damp walls. The air was getting thicker, and it was harder to breathe deeply. She felt the weight of the ground above her. She was far below the garden now, and the silence was total. There was no wind here, and no sounds from the village reached this deep. After a few more minutes, the tunnel opened into a small, square room. Sarah stopped and moved her light around the space. The walls were made of heavy grey stones, just like the tunnel. In one corner, there was an old wooden shelf with empty glass jars. In the center of the room stood a low table made of thick pieces of timber. The wood was dark with age and moisture. Sitting on top of the table was a heavy metal box. The box was about the size of a large book. It was made of dark iron and had reinforced corners. It looked very strong and very old. Sarah walked toward it slowly. Her heart was thumping against her ribs. She could see a layer of dust on the top of the box, but there were finger marks in the dust. Someone had touched this box recently. She looked at the front of the box. There was a large, circular lock. In the center of the lock was the same star shape she had seen on the gate and the clock tower. Sarah took the silver key out of her pocket. Her hand was shaking, so she used her other hand to keep it steady. She pushed the key into the lock. It went in smoothly, without any resistance. Sarah held her breath. She turned the key to the right. A heavy metallic sound echoed in the small stone room as the internal parts of the lock moved. The lid of the box jumped up a tiny bit. It was open. Sarah put the key back in her pocket and used both hands to lift the heavy iron lid. The hinges made a slow, dry sound. She pointed her flashlight inside. The box was not filled with gold. Instead, it was filled with papers. There was a thick leather folder and a stack of black and white photographs. Sarah felt a wave of many different emotions. She was disappointed not to find the gold, but she was excited to find the truth. She knew these papers were the reason Thomas Thorne was afraid. She picked up the leather folder. It felt cold and slightly damp. She opened it and saw a list of names and numbers. Next to the names, there were dates from many years ago. She recognized some of the family names from the village. At the bottom of the page, she saw the signature of the mayor's grandfather. "This is the evidence," Sarah whispered. Her voice sounded loud in the small room. She put the folder down and reached for the photographs. She wanted to see what was in them. She knew that these pictures would tell the story of the fire and the secret vault. She felt like she was very close to solving the mystery, but she also felt a sudden sense of danger. She was alone, deep underground, with the only proof of a century-old crime. Sarah sat on the cold stone floor. She held her flashlight in one hand and a photograph in the other. The image was black and white. It was a bit blurry, but she could see the people clearly. The photo showed two men standing in front of the bookstore. One man was young, but he had the same sharp eyes as the current mayor. This was the mayor's father or grandfather. The other man was Thomas Thorne. In the picture, they were not smiling. They were standing very close to each other. Their faces looked angry. Thomas was pointing his finger at the mayor's chest. The mayor was holding a thick envelope. Behind them, the bookstore window was broken. Sarah looked at the date written on the back of the photo. It was from 20 years ago, They were fighting a long time ago, Sarah thought. She picked up the next photograph. This one was even more shocking. It was a picture of the village square during a dark night. In the background, Sarah could see the clock tower. In the foreground, there was a large hole in the ground. Two men were carrying heavy bags out of the hole. One of the men was the mayor. He looked younger, but it was definitely him. They were putting the bags into the back of a black car. Sarah felt a cold wave of realization. The lost gold from the fire of 1920 was not lost at all. The mayor was taking it out of the vault in secret. The fire was just a story to keep people away. The mayor's family had been stealing the village's treasure for a very long time. She looked at the third photograph. It was a picture of a document. It was a map of the tunnels under the village. Sarah saw the path she had just walked. The map showed that the tunnel did not stop at this stone room. It continued even further. It went all the way to the town hall. Sarah understood everything now. Thomas Thorne found these photographs. He found the evidence of the theft. He tried to talk to the mayor, but the mayor was too powerful. Thomas had to hide the evidence in this box, and then he had to disappear to save his life. Suddenly, Sarah heard a noise. It was a very quiet sound. It came from the tunnel she had just walked through. It was the sound of a shoe hitting a stone. Someone was in the tunnel with her. Sarah turned off her flashlight immediately. The room became completely dark. She held her breath and stayed very still. Her heart was beating so loud that she was afraid the stranger would hear it. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall. The sound came again. It was closer now. It was a slow, steady walking sound. The person was moving carefully. Then, a thin beam of light appeared on the wall of the tunnel. Someone else had a flashlight. Sarah looked at the metal box. She could not leave it open. She reached out in the dark and quietly closed the heavy lid. It made a small sound as the metal touched. She stayed in the corner, hoping the shadows would hide her. She was trapped in the room with the secret, and the secret keeper was coming. Sarah pressed her body against the rough stone wall. The beam of light from the tunnel moved across the ceiling. It was a bright, white light. It hit the wooden table and the metal box. Sarah closed her eyes and held her breath. She did not move a single muscle. The air in the room felt very heavy. She heard the sound of breathing. It was slow and deep. The person was standing at the entrance of the small room. Sarah waited for the person to step inside. She waited for a hand to grab her shoulder. But the person stopped. For a long minute, there was only silence. Then, the light moved away. The sound of footsteps grew quieter as the person walked back toward the garden gate. Sarah waited for a long time. She sat in the total darkness for 10 minutes. Her heart slowly began to beat more quietly. She turned on her flashlight, but she kept the light low. She grabbed the leather folder and the photographs. She put them under her coat. She did not want to leave them in the box. She walked through the tunnel quickly. She did not care about the noise now. She just wanted to see the sky again. She reached the small wooden door and crawled out into the garden. The sun was almost gone. The sky was a dark purple color. Sarah ran through the hidden garden and locked the metal gate. She entered the bookstore through the back door. She locked it and pushed a heavy chair in front of it. She went to the front of the shop and checked the main door too. She was safe. But she was trembling. Her hands were cold, and her legs felt like water. She walked to her small desk behind the counter. She wanted to put the folder in the secret place under the floorboard. But when she reached the desk, she stopped. There was something new on the desk. In the middle of the dark wood sat a plain white envelope. Sarah had not put it there. She lived alone. She was the only person with a key to the front door. Someone had entered her shop while she was in the tunnel. She picked up the envelope. Her name was written on the front in tall, sharp letters. Sarah. She opened it with shaking fingers. Inside, there was a single piece of paper. There was no name and no date. There was only one sentence written in thick, black ink. Leave the past alone. Sarah looked around the empty shop. The shadows of the bookshelves looked like tall people. The silence of the room was scary now. The person who left this note knew she was looking for Thomas Thorne's secrets. They knew she was in the shop. They were watching her every move. She took the folder and the note. She went to the back room and lifted the loose floorboard. She put everything inside the hole and covered it. She felt a tear run down her face. She came to this village for a quiet life, but she found a nightmare instead. She knew she could not go to the local police. The mayor controlled the village. She was completely alone. Sarah sat behind the counter for a long time. She did not turn on the lights because she wanted to stay hidden in the dark. She watched the long shadows of the bookshelves on the floor. Her mind was full of the note. Who had been in her shop? How did they get in? She felt like she could not trust anyone. Every person in the village was a stranger to her now. Suddenly, a soft tapping sound came from the front door. Sarah jumped. She looked toward the glass. Through the thin curtains, she saw a familiar shape. It was a tall man wearing a hat and a long coat. It was Mr. Miller. Sarah did not move at first. She remembered the shadow at her window from the night before. Was he the person who left the note? Was he the person she heard in the tunnel? She felt a mix of fear and anger. She walked to the door but did not turn the lock. "What do you want, Mr. Miller?" she asked through the wood. Her voice was firm, but her hands were shaking. "Please, Sarah, open the door," Mr. Miller said. His voice was not loud, but it sounded very serious. "I saw the mayor's men near your shop. You are in danger. I need to talk to you about Thomas Thorne." Sarah hesitated. She looked at the street through a small gap in the curtain. The road was empty and silent. She slowly turned the lock and opened the door just a little bit. Mr. Miller stepped inside quickly. He took off his hat and looked around the dark shop. He looked very tired. There were deep lines on his face. "I was Thomas's only friend," he said quietly. "We worked together for many years. We knew the mayor was stealing money from the village. Thomas found the evidence, but he was afraid. He told me he was going to hide it in the shop." Sarah looked at him carefully. "Were you the shadow at my window last night?" Mr. Miller nodded. "Yes. I wanted to see if you were safe. I saw a different man near your shop earlier that evening. The mayor has many eyes in this village. He knows you are asking questions at the library. He does not want the past to return." "I found the red diary," Sarah said. She decided to trust him. She needed an ally. "And I found the metal box in the tunnel under the garden." Mr. Miller's eyes went wide. He sat down on a wooden chair. "You found the tunnel?" "Thomas never told me the exact location of the entrance. He was very careful. He wanted to protect me. He said that if I did not know where the secrets were, I would be safe from the mayor." "Why did Thomas disappear?" Sarah asked. "He had to leave," Mr. Miller replied. "The mayor found out that Thomas had the photographs. Thomas ran away to lead the mayor's men away from the village. He wanted the secret to stay here, hidden, until someone brave found it. He hoped that person would use the evidence to stop the Black family." Sarah felt a little better. She was not completely alone. "I have the photographs," she said. "But the local police will not help me." "No, they will not," Miller said. "But there is one more thing you must find. The gold fund records. They are the final proof of the theft. Thomas told me they are hidden in a very old place. He said they are under the village church. Sarah thought about the map from the library. The pencil lines went from her shop to the church. I have to go there, she said. Mr. Miller sat in the dark shop. He looked at his hands for a long time. The only light came from a small flashlight on the counter. It made a long, thin circle on the wooden floor. Sarah stood near him. She wanted to hear the rest of the story. She felt like she was close to the end of a long puzzle. Thomas was a very smart man. Mr. Miller began. His voice was low and serious. He spent years reading the old books in this shop. He found an old ledger from 1920. It was a book that listed all the gold owned by the village. That gold was meant to help the people. They wanted to build a hospital and a school. But after the fire, the gold was gone. The mayor's grandfather said the heat destroyed it. But gold doesn't just disappear, Sarah said. She remembered her thoughts from the library. Exactly, Mr. Miller replied. He looked at the window to make sure no one was there. Thomas realized that the fire was a lie. He started to follow the mayor's son, the man who is the mayor today. One night, about a year ago, Thomas saw a meeting. It was not in the town hall. It was in the basement of the village church. Sarah leaned forward. What did he see? He saw the mayor and two men from the city. Miller said. They were looking at the old gold coins. They were putting them into new boxes to sell them. The church basement is connected to the tunnels. It is the perfect place to hide things because no one ever goes down there. The priest is an old man who cannot hear very well. He stays in the house next door. Sarah thought about the map again. The lines on the paper finally made sense. The tunnels were a secret road for the mayor and his stolen treasure. Thomas tried to take a picture of the meeting. Miller continued. But he made a noise. A piece of wood fell, and the mayor heard him. Thomas ran through the tunnels and came back here to the bookstore. He knew he had to hide the evidence. He put the diary and the photos in the secret places you found. Then, he left the village that same night. Why didn't he go to the police in the city? Sarah asked. He tried to, Miller said sadly. But the mayor has friends everywhere. Thomas was afraid for his life. He told me that if he stayed, he would have an accident like the fire of 1920. He told me to wait. He said that one day, someone new would come to the shop. He said that person would be the key to the truth. Sarah felt a heavy responsibility. She was that person. She was the one Thomas was waiting for. I have to go to the church, she said. I have to find the ledger that lists the gold. If I have the photographs and the ledger, the mayor cannot lie anymore. It is very dangerous, Sarah. Mr. Miller warned. The mayor is watching the square. You must go late at night, when the village is asleep. Sarah nodded. She was scared, but she was also determined. She looked at the silver key. It was more than just a piece of metal. It was a tool for justice. Sarah waited until the middle of the night. The village was completely silent. The streetlights were dim, and most of the houses were dark. She wore a black jacket and dark trousers so she would be hard to see. She put her flashlight and the silver key in her pockets. She felt nervous, but she knew she had to do this for Thomas. She left the bookstore through the back door and walked through the hidden garden. She did not want to walk on the main street where the mayor might see her. She followed a narrow path behind the shops. The grass was wet with dew, and her shoes made a soft, brushing sound. Finally, she reached the back of the village square. The church stood at the far end of the square. It was a very old building made of heavy, grey stones. It had a tall tower that looked like a finger pointing at the moon. The windows were made of colored glass, but they looked black in the night. Sarah looked at the priest's house next door. All the lights were off. The old priest was asleep. Sarah walked to the side door of the church. She tried the handle. It was not locked. She pushed the door slowly. It made a long, low sound against the stone floor, but it was not loud. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The inside of the church was very large and very cold. The air smelled like old wood and burnt candles. Sarah did not turn on her flashlight yet. She waited for her eyes to adjust to the darkness. Long rows of wooden benches sat in the middle of the room. High above, the ceiling was lost in the shadows. She remembered what Mr. Miller told her. The entrance to the basement was near the front, behind the altar. She walked quietly down the center aisle. Every step felt very loud in the empty building. She reached the front and looked behind a heavy red curtain. There was a small door made of thick iron. It looked very strong. There was a circular lock in the middle of the door. Sarah took out the silver key. Her hands were cold, but she was steady now. She put the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, metallic sound. She pulled the iron door open. Behind it was a set of narrow stone stairs. They went deep down into the ground. The air coming from the hole was very cold and smelled like wet earth. Sarah turned on her flashlight. The beam of light showed the stairs were covered in dust. But she saw something interesting. There were fresh footprints in the dust. Someone had walked down these stairs very recently. Sarah took a deep breath. She started to walk down the stairs, one step at a time. She was leaving the quiet church and entering the secret world of the mayor. She knew that the truth was waiting at the bottom of these stairs. Sarah put her hand on the cold stone wall to stay steady. The stairs were very narrow and steep. Every step she took made a small, dry sound against the stone. She held her flashlight tightly in her other hand. The bright beam of light moved up and down the walls. The stones were wet and covered in a thin layer of green moss. The air was much colder here than it was inside the church. It smelled like damp earth and very old, wet stone. As she walked down, Sarah looked at the floor. The fresh footprints she saw at the top continued all the way down. They were large and clear in the thick dust. She realized that someone came here often. Was it the mayor? Or was it one of his men? She moved slowly and carefully. She did not want to make any noise. She felt like the walls were closing in on her. The ceiling was very low, and she had to bend her head. The staircase was long. It felt like she was walking deep into the heart of the earth. She thought about the village above her. People were sleeping in their warm beds. They did not know about the dark tunnels and the secrets under their feet. Sarah felt a moment of deep loneliness. She was far away from the world she knew. But then she thought about Thomas. He was brave enough to find the truth. She had to be brave too. Her flashlight hit a spiderweb that hung from the ceiling. It was thick and white. She moved it away with a small stick she found on the floor. She did not like the dark, but she had to keep going. Finally, the stairs ended. Sarah stepped onto a flat floor made of heavy, grey bricks. She shined her light around the area. She was in a large, square room. It looked like a very old cellar. There were large wooden pillars holding up the ceiling. In the corners, she saw old wooden crates and broken pieces of furniture. Everything was covered in a thick layer of grey dust. The silence in the room was very heavy. It felt like the room was waiting for something. Sarah walked toward the center of the room. She saw a small wooden table with a candle on it. The candle was not lit, but the wax was fresh. This was the proof she needed. Someone was using this room recently. She looked at the walls. They were not just stone. In some places, there were old drawings and maps carved into the rock. She moved her flashlight slowly across the back wall. She saw a large piece of paper pinned to the stone. It looked like a very old map. Her heart started to beat faster. She walked closer to the map to see what it was. She knew that this room was more than just a basement. It was a crossroads for all the secrets of the village. Sarah walked closer to the wall. The piece of paper was very large and very old. It was held to the stone wall by small, rusted metal pins. The paper was the color of a dead leaf, and the edges were torn. Sarah held her flashlight steady. The light showed a very detailed drawing of the village from a long time ago. At the top of the map, there were words written in beautiful, flowing letters. The underground paths of Blackwood Village, 1915. Sarah's eyes moved across the drawing. It was not a map of the streets or the houses. It was a map of what was under the streets. She saw the village square in the center. From the square, thick black lines moved out like the legs of a giant spider. One line went to the bookstore. Another line went to the town hall. A third line went to the church where she was standing right now. It is a network, Sarah whispered. She looked at the bottom of the map. There was a list of names. These were the people who owned the land 100 years ago. Next to the drawing of the bookstore, she saw a name. Thorne family. Next to the town hall and the church, the name was the same everywhere. The Black family. Sarah realized that the mayor's family did not just lead the village. They owned the ground beneath it. The tunnels were built before the Great Fire of 1920. The map showed small rooms along the tunnels. One room was labeled the Central Vault. It was located exactly under the village clock tower. There were notes written in the margins of the map in red ink. The handwriting was different from the original map. It was sharp and angry. Sarah recognized it from the note left on her desk. It was the handwriting of the current mayor. One note near the Central Vault said, "Transfer complete. Records moved to the secondary location." Another note near the bookstore said, "Watch the shop. Thorne knows too much." Sarah felt a cold shiver. This map was the master plan. It proved that the mayor used these tunnels to move the village gold in secret. He used the tunnels to watch people and to hide his crimes. The fire of 1920 was the perfect cover. When the buildings above burned, the mayor told everyone the gold was lost. But the gold was safe in these stone rooms, moving through the dark. She took out her phone. She wanted to take a picture of the map, but the screen was dark. The battery was dead. She felt a moment of panic. She needed to remember every detail. She looked at the red lines again. She noticed a small, hidden path that went from the town hall to a place near the river. Suddenly, the air in the room changed. Sarah felt a small movement of wind. It was very slight, like a door opening somewhere far away. The silence of the basement was gone. She heard a very quiet, rhythmic sound. It was the sound of leather shoes walking on the brick floor. The footsteps were coming from the staircase. Sarah turned off her flashlight. The darkness was thick and heavy. She moved away from the map and hid behind a large wooden pillar. She pressed her back against the wood and tried to breathe quietly. Her heart was beating so hard she thought it would hit the pillar. Someone was in the basement with her, and they were not trying to be quiet anymore. Sarah stayed behind the wooden pillar. She did not move. She did not even breathe deeply. The footsteps on the brick floor stopped near the old map. Suddenly, a bright light filled the room. It was much stronger than Sarah's small flashlight. She saw the light reflecting off the stone walls. "It is still here," a voice said. It was the deep, cold voice of Mayor Black. "The map is old, sir." Another voice replied. This voice was younger and sounded nervous. "Are you sure the path is still safe? The woman in the bookstore is asking many questions. She went to the library today." Sarah felt a cold wave of fear. They were talking about her. She pressed her back against the wood. She could feel the rough texture of the pillar through her jacket. Sarah is a problem, the mayor said. His voice was angry now. She is like Thomas Thorne. She wants to find things that do not belong to her. My family has protected this village for 100 years. We built the roads. We built the school. The people here are happy because we lead them. But the gold, sir. The younger man started to say. The gold belongs to the Black family. The mayor interrupted. My grandfather was a genius. He knew that money brings trouble. He used the fire of 1920 to keep the wealth safe. Everyone thought it was gone, so they stopped looking for it. That gold is our legacy. It is the reason we have power. Sarah listened closely. She realized the true secret. The mayor did not just want the money. He wanted the power that came with it. The Black family owned the village because they had the treasure hidden under the ground. The mayor walked closer to the map. Sarah saw his shadow on the opposite wall. It was a long, dark shape that looked like a monster. The final vault is the most important part. The mayor said quietly. It is located directly under the bookstore. That shop was built over the main entrance to the tunnel system. That is why Thomas Thorne had to leave. And that is why Sarah cannot stay. Sarah's heart stopped for a second. The treasure was under her feet every day. Her bookstore was the center of the whole mystery. The mayor wanted her shop because he wanted to control the entrance to the gold. What should we do with her? The younger man asked. We will wait. The mayor replied. We will watch her. If she finds the final vault, we will take the evidence from her. Then, we will make sure she leaves the village and never returns. Just like Thomas. The two men began to walk toward the other side of the basement. Sarah heard the sound of a heavy metal door opening. Then, the light disappeared. The basement was dark and silent again. Sarah waited for a long time before she moved. She felt like the world was falling apart. Her home was not a home. It was a hiding place for a century of lies. She knew she had to find the final vault before the mayor found her. Sarah waited behind the pillar. The air was very still. She heard the younger man's footsteps go up the stairs. But the mayor did not follow him. Instead, the mayor's flashlight stayed on. The beam of light moved across the floor. Sarah realized the mayor was not finished. She needed to see what he was doing. But the pillar was too far away. She saw a large wooden crate about 3 meters away. It was tall and wide. She waited until the mayor turned his back. Then, she moved. She stayed low to the ground. Her knees hit the hard brick floor. But she did not make a sound. She slid behind the crate and sat on her heels. The crate smelled like old vinegar and wet wood. The mayor walked to the back wall. He stood in front of a heavy, dark curtain. The curtain was covered in dust and spiderwebs. He reached out and pulled the fabric. The sound of the heavy cloth moving was like a soft sigh. Behind the curtain, there was a small area of the wall made of dark oak wood. Sarah watched through a small gap between 2 pieces of wood on the crate. The mayor took a small silver tool from his pocket. He did not use a key. He pressed the tool into a small hole in the wood. A flash of light appeared as a small door clicked open. It was a hidden safe inside the wall. The mayor reached inside. He pulled out a small, heavy bag. He opened the bag, and Sarah saw a bright, yellow glow. Even in the dim light of the basement, the gold was beautiful. These were the coins of the village fund. They were not lost in the fire. They were here, hidden behind a dirty curtain in a church. The mayor held a coin between his fingers. He looked at it for a long time. He looked like a man who was dreaming. He was not thinking about the village or the people. He was only thinking about the wealth. He put the coin back into the bag and placed the bag into the safe. It is almost time, the mayor said to himself. His voice was a low growl. Once the bookstore is mine, the path will be clear. No more secrets. Only power. He closed the wooden door and pulled the curtain back. He turned off his flashlight for a moment. Sarah stayed perfectly still in the total darkness. Then, she heard him walk toward the stairs. His footsteps were heavy and slow. She heard the door at the top of the basement open and then close. A loud click followed. He had locked her inside. Sarah sat in the dark. Her heart was beating very fast. She was trapped in the basement with the gold and the secrets. But she was not afraid. She was angry. She knew the truth now, and she knew she had to find a way out. She reached for her own flashlight. It was time to find the tunnel the mayor mentioned. Sarah stood up in the pitch-black basement. The click of the lock at the top of the stairs echoed in her mind. She was trapped, but she didn't let panic take hold. She took a deep breath, the cold, damp air filling her lungs, and switched on her flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the swirling dust she had kicked up. She didn't go back to the stairs. She knew the mayor wouldn't have left them open. Instead, she walked back to the old map on the wall. She looked at the red lines again, specifically the one connecting the church to her bookstore. The entrance must be here, she whispered. She began to examine the wall behind the heavy curtain where the mayor had accessed the safe. She pushed against the stones, feeling for anything loose or hollow. Her fingers brushed against a small iron lever hidden behind a protruding rock near the floor. It was cold and rusted. She gripped it with both hands and pulled. With a grinding sound of stone on stone, a section of the wall, disguised as solid rock, swung inward. A gust of stale, earthy air hit her face. It was another tunnel, but this one was different from the one in her garden. The walls here were reinforced with old timber, and the floor was lined with smooth river stones. This was the main artery of the village's secret history. Sarah stepped inside. The tunnel was narrow, and the ceiling was so low she had to walk in a constant crouch. As she moved forward, she noticed small alcoves in the walls. In one, she found an old, broken lantern. In another, a stack of rotted wooden crates. These tunnels hadn't just been used for moving gold. They had been used for storage, for hiding, and perhaps for escaping. She followed the path for what felt like miles, though she knew it couldn't be more than a few hundred meters. Her flashlight began to flicker. She shook it, praying the batteries would last. The tunnel started to slope upward. Suddenly, the stone path ended at a wall of solid wood. Sarah shined her light upward and saw a heavy wooden trapdoor. It was reinforced with iron bars. She pushed against it, but it didn't budge. She realized she was directly underneath a building. She looked around the small space at the end of the tunnel. On a small ledge, she found a rusted metal key, much larger and heavier than the silver one. She grabbed it and inserted it into a lock on the side of the trapdoor frame. It turned with a loud, echoing clunk. She pushed again. This time, the door moved. Light, real, soft moonlight, poured into the tunnel. Sarah climbed up and found herself in a room she recognized instantly. The smell of old paper and peppermint tea hit her. She was in the back room of her own bookstore. But as she stood up and brushed the dust from her clothes, she realized she wasn't alone. Sitting in her desk chair, illuminated by the moon through the window, was Mr. Miller. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the red diary she had hidden under the floorboards. It was open in his lap. "I wondered how long it would take you to find the church entrance, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. Sarah stood frozen, her hands still resting on the edge of the trapdoor. The dust from the tunnel coated her clothes, and her breath came in ragged gasps. The moonlight carved deep shadows into Mr. Miller's face, making him look like a different person, older, harder, and far less kind than the man who had offered her tea just days ago. "You weren't supposed to find that path so quickly," Miller said, his eyes fixed on the diary. "Thomas spent months searching for the church connection. You did it in a night. I suppose your history teacher instincts are sharper than his were." Sarah stepped fully into the room, her boots clicking softly on the floorboards. "You were his friend, Mr. Miller. You told me you wanted to help. Why are you sitting here in the dark, reading his private thoughts?" Miller finally looked up. His eyes were cold. "Friendship is a heavy word. Sarah, Thomas and I were partners. We found the truth together. But Thomas was a dreamer. He wanted to be a hero. He wanted to hand over the gold to a village that has ignored the black family's crimes for a century." He stood up slowly, the red diary clutched in his hand. "I told him it was a mistake. I told him the gold was our payment for all the years we spent as eccentric shopkeepers while the mayor lived in a mansion built on stolen wealth." Sarah felt a sick realization in her stomach. "You're the one who wrote the note. Leave the past alone. You weren't trying to protect me from the mayor. You were trying to keep the secret for yourself." "I was trying to save you the trouble of disappearing," Miller snapped. "The mayor is a fool, but he is a dangerous fool. He thinks the gold is still in the central vault. He doesn't realize that Thomas and I moved a portion of it years ago. We moved it right here, under this very floor." He gestured to the loose floorboard where Sarah had hidden the diary. "But Thomas got scared. He hid the key to the final safe, the silver key you're carrying in your pocket right now." Sarah instinctively reached for her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the key. Miller noticed the movement and a thin, mirthless smile touched his lips. "The mayor thinks you're a threat because you might find the truth," Miller said, stepping closer. "But I know you're a threat because you have the key. Give it to me, Sarah. I'll make sure you leave this village with enough money to never work another day in your life. Just walk away." "And what happened to Thomas?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling but steady. "You said he ran away. Is that another lie?" Miller's expression softened for a split second, a flicker of something like regret passing over his face. "Thomas was stubborn. He wouldn't listen. We had an argument. Near the well in the forest. He fell. Sarah. It was an accident. But the village wouldn't see it that way. They'd see a business partner who wanted more than his share." Sarah backed away toward the front of the shop. She wasn't just facing the mayor's corruption anymore. She was facing a man who had already let one friend die for the sake of the gold. "I'm not giving you the key, Mr. Miller," she said firmly. "This doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people of Blackwood." Miller's face darkened. The kindness was gone now, replaced by a desperate, sharp hunger. "The people. They don't even know it's gone. They won't miss what they never had. But I've waited 10 years for this. I won't let a girl who's been here for a week take it away from me." Miller lunged forward, his shadow stretching across the floor like a reaching claw. Sarah scrambled backward, her heels catching on the edge of the open trapdoor. She nearly fell back into the dark tunnel, but she found her balance at the last second. She swung her heavy flashlight, the beam cutting a chaotic arc through the air, and caught Miller directly in the eyes. He groaned, shielding his face with his arm. "You little fool. You have no idea what you're holding." "I know exactly what it is," Sarah shouted, her voice echoing off the stacks of books. "It's the evidence that can end this. The gold, the lies, all of it." She ran from the back room into the main shop. The towering bookshelves felt like a maze. Miller was fast for his age, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic behind her. She knew she couldn't outrun him forever, and the front door was locked. She needed to find the final mechanism the mayor had mentioned, the one Thomas had hidden. She remembered the map. The lines had converged right here, in the center of the shop. She skidded to a halt in front of the massive, immovable oak counter. It was the heart of the bookstore, thick and ancient. She dropped to her knees, frantically searching the wood near the floor. "It has to be here," she whispered. Her fingers brushed against a small, raised carving on the side of the counter. It was a star, identical to the one on the silver key. "Sarah, stop." Miller's voice was closer now. He was at the entrance to the main room, breathing hard. He held a heavy iron bookend he'd grabbed from a shelf. "Don't turn that key. If you open that vault, the alarm in the town hall will go off. The mayor will be here in minutes. We can both be gone before he arrives if you just give it to me." Sarah didn't listen. She jammed the silver key into the star-shaped hole. It fit with a satisfying, precision click. She turned it. Instead of a door opening, a deep, mechanical hum began to vibrate through the floorboards. The entire counter, thousands of pounds of oak, began to slide slowly to the left. Dust clouds billowed up as a hidden elevator platform was revealed beneath the floor. On the platform sat 3 heavy iron chests, their lids sealed with wax. But before Sarah could move, the front windows of the shop shattered. Glass exploded inward as a heavy black boot kicked through the front door. 2 men in dark suits stepped inside, followed by a man whose silhouette Sarah knew all too well. Mayor Black stepped over the broken glass, a small, silver pistol held casually in his hand. He looked at the moving counter, then at Miller, and finally at Sarah. "I must thank you, Sarah," the mayor said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "Thomas was too clever for his own good. He hid the final cache so well that even I couldn't find the trigger. I knew if I let you stay here long enough, your curiosity would do the work for me." He looked at Mr. Miller with disgust. "Ann Miller, I knew you were a thief, but I didn't think you were a traitor. You were supposed to be watching her for me, not trying to steal my family's legacy. Your family's legacy is a crime, Black," Miller yelled, though he backed away from the mayor's weapon. Sarah stood between the 2 men, the open vault at her feet. She realized she was no longer just a witness. She was the only person standing between the village's stolen past and the men who wanted to bury it forever. The shop was silent, save for the crunch of glass under the mayor's boots. The smell of cold night air and gunpowder, from a warning shot the mayor had fired into the ceiling, hung heavy in the room. Sarah stood by the open vault, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Step away from the chests, Sarah," Mayor Black commanded, gesturing with the pistol. "Miller, get against the wall. You've outlived your usefulness." Miller looked at the chests, then at the mayor. His face was a mask of desperation. "You can't take it all, Black. Half of that belonged to the families Thorne and I represented. It belongs to the history of this village." The mayor countered with a sneer. "And I am the one who writes that history." As the mayor's men moved forward to lift the first iron chest, Sarah noticed something. The chests weren't just filled with gold coins. Sitting right on top of the nearest one, tucked under a heavy velvet cloth, was a thick, leather-bound book. It wasn't red like the diary, it was black, and the cover was embossed with the official seal of Blackwood. It was the 1920 ledger. This was the gold fund record Miller had mentioned, the definitive proof of exactly how much wealth had been in the vault before the fire and where it had actually gone. "The book," Sarah whispered. The mayor's eyes flicked to the ledger. His calm demeanor slipped for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flash of pure panic. "Don't touch that." But Miller saw it too. Realizing the gold was lost to him, he chose chaos. With a roar of rage, he threw the heavy iron bookend at the nearest guard. The guard ducked, and in the confusion, Sarah dove for the vault. Her fingers brushed the cold, cracked leather of the ledger. She pulled it toward her just as the mayor fired again. The bullet struck the oak counter, sending splinters of wood flying. Sarah rolled behind the heavy structure, the ledger clutched to her chest. It was heavier than she expected, smelling of ancient dust and the metallic scent of gold. "Grab her!" The mayor screamed. Sarah looked around. She was trapped behind the counter. The elevator platform she had come up on was still open. To her left was the trapdoor leading back to the tunnels. To her right, the broken front window. But she knew she couldn't outrun them in the street. She opened the ledger to the last page. Her eyes scanned the entries. There, in the mayor's grandfather's handwriting, was a list of every bribe paid to the city officials and every coin moved into the Black family private accounts. But at the very bottom, there was a final note. In the event of a breach, the signal in the belfry is the only truth that remains. Sarah looked at the silver key still in the lock of the counter. She realized the star shape wasn't just for the vault. She grabbed the key, twisted it a third time, not to the right, but to the left. A different sound filled the bookstore. It wasn't a hum. It was a high-pitched, mechanical whistle that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the building. Far off in the distance, in the center of the square, the great clock tower began to chime. But it wasn't ringing the hour. It was the fire bell, the alarm that hadn't been heard since 1920. The mayor's face went white. "Shut it off. Shut it off now." "I can't." Sarah yelled over the rising noise. "The whole village is waking up. Mr. Black. They're coming to see why the fire bell is ringing. And I have the book that explains everything." The sound of the fire bell was deafening. It was a rhythmic, iron clang that shook the very glass in the bookstore's remaining windows. In the silence of the night, it was a call that could not be ignored. Lights began to flicker on in the apartments above the bakery and the pharmacy. Shouts echoed from the square as the people of Blackwood, a village that had slept through a century of secrets, began to stir. Mayor Black was no longer the calm, calculated man Sarah had met at the cafe. His face was flushed with a mixture of terror and fury. "Kill the bell," he screamed at his men. "And get that book from her." One of the guards lunged over the oak counter, his fingers clawing at the ledger. Sarah scrambled back, holding the heavy book to her chest like a shield. She felt the edge of the open trapdoor behind her. "Stay back," she cried, her voice barely audible over the bell. Mr. Miller, seeing his chance to escape the mayor's wrath, didn't head for the door. Instead, he dove toward the iron chests. "If I'm going down, I'm taking what's mine," he yelled, grabbing a handful of gold coins. But he was clumsy in his greed. He tripped over the guard's foot and tumbled into the open vault, his gold scattering across the floor like yellow rain. Sarah knew she couldn't stay in the back room. She turned and ran toward the narrow staircase that led to her upstairs apartment. If she could reach the balcony overlooking the street, she could show the village the truth before the mayor could silence her. "She's going up," the mayor barked. Sarah's feet pounded against the wooden stairs. She could hear the heavy boots of the guards behind her. She reached her apartment, slammed the door, and shoved the heavy dresser against it. It wouldn't hold them for long, but it gave her seconds. She ran to the window and threw it open. Below, the square was filling with people. Some were in pajamas, others in coats thrown over nightshirts. Mrs. Gable, the librarian, stood near the fountain, looking up at the clock tower in confusion. "Mrs. Gable!" "Everyone!" Sarah shouted, leaning out into the cold air. The crowd looked up. They saw the new girl from the bookstore, silhouetted against the light of her room, holding a thick black book over her head. The fire of 1920 was a lie. Sarah's voice carried through the crisp night. The gold wasn't lost. The Black family has been hiding it under this shop for 100 years. It's all in here. Every name, every bribe, every coin stolen from your grandfathers. A murmur rippled through the crowd. It wasn't a sound of confusion anymore. It was the low, dangerous growl of a people realizing they had been betrayed. Behind her, the dresser groaned as the guards threw their weight against the door. The wood began to splinter. Sarah looked down at the crowd. The mayor is inside. She yelled. He has his men and the gold. Don't let them hide the truth again. At that moment, the apartment door burst open. The dresser toppled over. Mayor Black stepped into the room, his chest heaving. He looked at the window, then at the crowd below, and finally at Sarah. He raised the silver pistol, but his hand was shaking. He could hear the voices from the street. Names were being shouted, demands for justice rising like the smoke from the old fire. "Give me the book, Sarah," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's over." "You're right, Mr. Black," Sarah said, her heart finally finding a steady beat. "It is over." The mayor stood in the center of Sarah's small apartment, his pistol leveled at her chest. But the power he had carried for decades was gone. Outside, the fire bell continued to toll, a relentless heartbeat that had summoned the entire village. The roar of the crowd below was no longer a murmur. It was a demand. "They won't believe you," the mayor hissed, though his eyes darted to the window. "I am the mayor. I am Blackwood. You are a stranger." "I was a stranger," Sarah said, stepping toward the balcony. "But this book isn't. Your grandfather's handwriting is on every page. The bank records, the hidden transfers, the maps of the tunnels. It's all here. You can't shoot an entire village. Mr. Black." The sound of heavy boots echoed from the stairs, not the rhythmic thud of the mayor's guards, but the disorganized, heavy climb of many people. The dresser was shoved aside as Mrs. Gable, the librarian, and several of the village's shopkeepers burst into the room. Behind them were two officers from the neighboring district, their blue uniforms a sharp contrast to the shadows of the bookstore. "Lower the weapon, Arthur," Mrs. Gable said, her voice shaking but her eyes fierce. "We've heard enough. We've seen the vault." The mayor's arm dropped. The silver pistol clattered to the floor. He looked at the faces of the people he had ruled with fear and secrets, and for the first time, he saw them not as subjects, but as judges. The guards, seeing the tide had turned, surrendered without a word. The aftermath. The sun began to rise over Blackwood, casting a golden light that felt different than the yellow glow of the stolen coins. The village square was filled with life. The police had cordoned off the bookstore, and the iron chests were being carefully moved to the town hall, not as the Black family's treasure, but as the village's future. The ledger. The 1920 ledger provided enough evidence to freeze all of the mayor's assets and clear the names of the families who had been blamed for the lost gold. Mr. Miller. He was found in the vault, clutching a bag of coins. He was taken into custody, though his testimony eventually helped the authorities find the location in the forest where Thomas Thorne had met his tragic end. The gold. The fund was restored. Plans were immediately drafted for the hospital and school that had been delayed for 100 years. Sarah sat on the front steps of her shop, a cup of warm tea in her hands. Her clothes were torn and covered in the dust of a century, but she felt a peace she hadn't known since arriving. Mrs. Gable walked over and sat beside her. Thomas would be proud. Sarah. He didn't just leave you a shop. He left you the truth. He knew you were the only one who wouldn't stop looking. Sarah looked up at the clock tower. The fire bell was silent now, but the clock was ticking again, moving forward into a new era. She looked back at the bookstore, her bookstore. The windows were broken and the floor was a mess, but for the first time, it truly felt like home. 2 weeks had passed since the night the fire bell rang. Blackwood was a changed village. The heavy air of suspicion that had hung over the square for decades had finally begun to lift. Construction crews were already working on the foundations of the new school, funded by the recovered gold. Mayor Black and his associates were awaiting trial in the city, and the bookstore was finally being repaired. Sarah stood on a ladder, wiping the soot from the top of a mahogany bookshelf. The front window had been replaced with thick, clear glass, and the oak counter was back in its rightful place, though the secret elevator remained sealed for the police investigation. The shop felt lighter, but for Sarah, the mystery wasn't entirely over. Something was still bothering her. Every morning, she received letters from across the country. Journalists, historians, and distant relatives of the Thorne family. But one envelope, tucked at the bottom of today's stack, was different. It didn't have a return address. It was made of thick, cream-colored paper, and her name was written in a handwriting she knew all too well. The neat, small script of Thomas Thorne. Her heart skipped a beat. She climbed down the ladder, her hands trembling. She sat at her small desk and stared at the postmark. It was from a town called Oak Haven, located only 50 miles away. The most shocking part was the date. It had been stamped 3 days ago, long after Mr. Miller claimed Thomas had died in the forest. "He's alive," she whispered to the empty room. She tore the envelope open. Inside was a single black and white photograph and a small, dried flower, a bluebell. The photograph wasn't of a person. It was of an old stone bridge over a rushing river. On the back, a single sentence was written. "The truth has many layers, and the surface is only the beginning. Look behind the map, not at it." Sarah pulled the red diary from her desk drawer. She had kept it as a personal memento. She looked at the drawings Thomas had made. She remembered the old map in the church basement, the one with the red lines. Thomas had told her to look behind the map. She grabbed her flashlight and headed back to the church. The old priest, now aware of the tunnels, gave her a silent nod as she entered. She descended the cold stairs, the smell of damp earth greeting her like an old friend. She reached the square room and stood before the empty space where the 1915 map had hung. The police had taken the original map for evidence, but the stone wall behind it remained. She shined her light on the rough surface. At first, it looked like ordinary rock, but as she moved the beam, she saw a faint indentation, a circle about the size of a coin. She reached out and pressed her thumb into the center of the circle. With a click that resonated through the silent chamber, a small stone block slid backward, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small, leather-bound cylinder and a silver compass. Sarah realized that the gold was only the tip of the iceberg. Thomas Thorne hadn't just been protecting a treasure. He had been guarding a secret that was much older than the fire of 1920. The compass didn't point north. Instead, the needle spun wildly before settling on a direction that led straight through the wall toward the dark forest of Oak Haven. Sarah stood in the dim light of the church basement, the silver compass resting in the palm of her hand. Unlike a standard compass, which sought the magnetic north, this needle vibrated with a faint, rhythmic hum. It seemed to pulse in time with her own heartbeat. The leather-bound cylinder she had found alongside it felt surprisingly heavy, as if it were filled with more than just paper. She carefully unscrewed the cap of the cylinder. Inside was a single scroll of vellum, yellowed by age but remarkably preserved. As she unrolled it, she realized it wasn't a map of the land, but a map of the stars as they appeared over Blackwood exactly 100 years ago. Small, pinprick holes had been punched through the vellum, and when she held it up to her flashlight, the light shone through the holes, creating a constellation on the stone wall. One star in particular, one that shouldn't have been there according to modern charts, glowed the brightest. It aligned perfectly with the direction the silver compass was currently pointing. "Oak Haven. What were you looking at, Thomas?" she whispered, her voice echoing in the hollow chamber. "The gold was just a distraction, wasn't it?" She realized that while the village was celebrating the recovery of their wealth, Thomas Thorne had been obsessed with something far more ancient. The layers he mentioned in his letter were beginning to reveal themselves. The fire of 1920 wasn't just a cover for theft. It was a cover for a discovery that the Black family, and perhaps Thomas himself, had tried to keep from the world. Sarah climbed out of the basement and returned to the bookstore. She spent the rest of the night packing a small bag. She included her heavy coat, a sturdy pair of boots, the red diary, and the new artifacts. She felt a strange sense of urgency, as if the needle's pull were getting stronger with every passing hour. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, Sarah locked the front door of the bookstore. She left a note for Mrs. Gable, telling her she would be away for a few days to clear her head. She walked to the small train station at the edge of the village. The platform was empty except for a single man sitting on a wooden bench. He wore a tweed jacket and held a weathered leather suitcase. When Sarah approached, the man stood up. He had a kind, tired face and eyes that seemed to have seen far too much. "You're the one from the bookstore," he said, his voice soft. "Sarah, isn't it?" Sarah hesitated, her hand gripping the strap of her bag. "Yes. Do I know you?" "My name is Elias," he said, offering a small, sad smile. "I was a friend of Thomas's long ago, before the darkness took hold of this place. I saw you at the square during the bell ringing. You have his eyes, not the color, but the hunger for the truth." He reached into his pocket and handed her a small, rusted iron key. "The bridge in the photograph you received. It has a gatehouse. This key will open the door. But be warned, Sarah, Oakhaven is not like Blackwood. In Blackwood, the secrets are buried under the ground. In Oakhaven, they are alive in the trees." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, the train whistle blew, a mournful sound that signaled her departure. Elias stepped back into the shadows of the station house. "Don't trust the silence," he called out as the train pulled into the station. Sarah boarded the train, her mind spinning. She sat by the window, watching the familiar sights of Blackwood fade into the distance. The silver compass in her pocket grew warm against her leg, its needle fixed firmly on the dark, ancient woods of Oakhaven. The train journey to Oakhaven felt like a descent into another world. As the locomotive pulled away from the platform, the neat, manicured hedges of the valley were replaced by the gnarled, ancient limbs of an overgrown forest. The station at Oakhaven was little more than a wooden shack, reclaimed by ivy and damp rot. When Sarah stepped off, she was the only passenger. The air here was heavy, smelling of pine needles and something sharp, like ozone before a thunderstorm. Following the direction of the silver compass, which remained warm in her pocket, Sarah began her trek into the woods. The path was barely visible, obscured by a carpet of thick moss and fallen leaves. The trees here were different from those in Blackwood. Their trunks were twisted into impossible shapes, and their leaves were a deep, bruised purple rather than green. After an hour of walking, the sound of rushing water filled the air. Sarah pushed through a final thicket of ferns and stopped. There it was, the stone bridge from the photograph. It was a massive, weathered structure of grey granite, arching gracefully over a river that churned with white foam. On the far side of the bridge sat the gatehouse, a small, circular tower made of the same stone, with a steeply pitched roof of slate. Sarah's heart hammered as she crossed the bridge. The water below seemed unnaturally dark, almost black. She reached the heavy oak door of the gatehouse and pulled out the rusted iron key Elias had given her. It felt ancient in her hand. She slid it into the lock, expecting it to be stuck, but it turned with a smooth, oiled silence. Inside, the gatehouse was not the dusty ruin she had expected. A small fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting a golden glow over a room filled with books, maps, and strange brass instruments. On a wooden table sat a half-empty cup of tea, still wisping with steam. Someone had been here only minutes ago. Sarah walked to the table. Beside the tea lay a leather-bound notebook, open to a page filled with complex astronomical calculations. But it wasn't the math that caught her eye. It was a sketch in the corner of the page. It was a drawing of the bookstore's front window, viewed from the street. Underneath it was written, "She arrived on the 14th. She is the one." A sudden draft of cold air swept through the room as the back door, hidden behind a heavy tapestry, creaked open. Sarah spun around, her hand reaching for her flashlight. "I told Elias you would have the courage to follow the needle," a voice said. Out of the shadows stepped a man. He was tall, with hair as white as the foam on the river and a face lined with years of solitude. He wore a heavy wool cloak, and around his neck hung a silver pendant shaped like a star. It wasn't Thomas Thorne, he was too old for that. But the resemblance was unmistakable. "I am Silas Thorne," the man said, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "Thomas's father. And you, Sarah, are standing in the middle of a war that began long before the Black family ever stole a single coin." Sarah stood her ground, the weight of the silver compass in her pocket feeling heavier than ever. "Thomas is alive, isn't he? He sent the letter." Silas sighed, moving toward the hearth. "He is alive, but he is not where you think he is. The tunnels in Blackwood didn't just lead to gold, Sarah. They led to a threshold. And Thomas, in his desperation to save the village, crossed it." Sarah stared at Silas Thorne, her mind reeling. The warmth of the hearth did little to chill the shiver that ran down her spine. "A threshold? What do you mean?" "I saw the vault. I saw the gold. It was a crime of greed, Silas. Simple and ugly." Silas shook his head, his white hair catching the orange light of the fire. He moved to a large, wooden drafting table and cleared away a stack of star charts. Underneath lay a blueprint of Blackwood, but it wasn't the one Sarah had seen in the library. This one was translucent, with a second, darker map layered beneath it. The lines of the lower map were jagged, organic, and seemed to pulse when viewed from the corner of her eye. Greed was the mayor's motive, yes, Silas said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. But the Black family didn't just stumble upon that gold. They were the original wardens. Centuries ago, the founders of this village discovered a thinning in the fabric of the world. A rift, located precisely where your bookstore stands today. They found that gold, a specific type of star iron minted into coins, acted as a physical anchor. It kept the rift closed. It kept the others on the side of the shadows. Sarah leaned over the table, her eyes tracing the jagged lines. The fire of 1920. It wasn't just to hide the theft. It was a failed ritual. Silas explained. The mayor's grandfather grew arrogant. He thought he could harness the energy of the rift to create eternal wealth. He moved the anchor, the gold, and the rift began to bleed. The fire was the result of that energy discharging. To save their own skins, the Black family built the vault to contain the energy, but they kept the gold for themselves, thinking they had mastered the beast. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. By uncovering the vault and moving the gold to the town hall, I've moved the anchor. I've weakened the seal. Precisely, Silas said. Thomas realized this a year ago. He didn't run away because he was scared of the mayor. He ran because he saw the shadows starting to seep through the floorboards of the shop. He knew he couldn't stop the mayor alone, so he went looking for a way to reinforce the rift from the other side. He crossed the threshold in the church basement, entering the under Blackwood, a reflection of our world where the rift is a gaping wound. Sarah looked at the silver compass in her hand. The needle was no longer spinning. It was pointing directly at Silas. "And you? Why are you here in Oak Haven?" "I am the gatekeeper," Silas said simply. "This lodge sits on the second anchor point. The river below carries the runoff of the rift's energy. I've spent 20 years keeping the forest from being consumed by the purple rot you saw on your way here. But I am old. Sarah. And Thomas. He's been gone too long. He's losing himself in the echoes of the under Blackwood. He reached out and touched the leather-bound cylinder Sarah had brought. You found the celestial map. That is the key to navigating the echoes. Thomas left it for the one who would replace him. He knew that if the gold was ever disturbed, a new warden would need to step forward. I didn't ask for this, Sarah said, her voice trembling. I just wanted to run a bookstore. The bookstore chose you, Sarah, just as it chose Thomas. The books on those shelves are not just stories. They are the collective memory of the village, used to weigh down the silence of the rift. Silas looked her in the eye. If you want to save Thomas, and your village, you have to go back. But you won't be going back to the Blackwood, you know. You will be going down. Sarah stood by the flickering hearth, the weight of Silas's words sinking in. The idea of a rift and star iron sounded like the very fiction she sold on her shelves. Yet the cold vibration of the silver compass in her pocket was a reality she couldn't ignore. She looked at the old man, his face etched with a century of secrets. If the gold was the anchor, Sarah began, her voice gaining a steady edge. And I moved it. Why hasn't the bookstore been swallowed already? Silas walked to a shelf and pulled down a small, leather-bound volume. Because of the books. Sarah. You wondered why Thomas kept such a specific collection. Why the shelves were so packed, and why he was so particular about the organization. He handed her the book. It was heavy, impossibly heavy for its size. The stories of humanity, the shared history, the weight of thought. These things have a metaphysical mass. The bookstore is a literal paperweight holding down the corner of a tearing reality. Sarah opened the book Silas gave her. The pages were blank, yet as she looked at them, she felt a strange sensation of being watched from within the paper. But the mayor's men threw the books around. They broke the shelves. The balance is failing, isn't it? It is, Silas said gravely. And now that the gold is in the town hall, the rift is seeking a new exit. It's following the money. But the source remains under your floorboards. If you don't go into the under Blackwood and pull Thomas back, or at least finish the ritual he started, the rift will fully open. It won't just be Blackwood. The others will have a doorway into this entire valley. He reached into a cabinet and pulled out a small, glass vial filled with a swirling, silvery liquid that gave off a soft, pulsing glow. This is liquid starlight, distilled from the runoff of the river. It will not last long, but it will show you the path in the reflection. In the under Blackwood, logic is a luxury. Your memory and your intent will be your only maps. Sarah took the phial. It felt warm, almost humming against her skin. How do I get back? The train won't come for hours. You won't take the train, Silas said, pointing to the dark river outside the window. The river flows through the rift. There is a small skiff under the bridge. Take it. Let the current pull you. Do not row, and for the love of all that is light, do not look into the water. The river doesn't just carry water. It carries the memories of those who fell into the dark. Sarah packed the phial, the celestial map, and the silver compass into her bag. She felt a strange transition occurring within herself. She was no longer the woman who had moved to a quiet village for a fresh start. She was becoming a part of the village's ancient machinery. Why me, Silas? She asked one last time at the door. Why did Thomas choose to leave the shop to a stranger instead of you? Silas offered a sad, thin smile. Because I am part of the old blood. Sarah. I am too close to the rift. It knows my scent. It would have consumed me the moment I stepped inside. You have no history with this place. You are an anchor of the present. You are the only one the shadows don't recognize. Sarah stepped out into the damp, purple-hued woods of Oakhaven. The sound of the river was no longer a gentle rush. It was a beckoning roar. She found the small wooden skiff tied beneath the granite arch of the bridge. As she untied the rope and stepped in, the silver compass began to spin wildly, no longer pointing to Oakhaven, but straight down into the black depths of the water. The moment the rope fell away from the iron ring, the skiff didn't just drift, it was seized by the current. The water beneath the boat didn't splash or ripple in the way Sarah expected. Instead, it felt thick, like liquid velvet, and it moved with a terrifying, silent speed. The granite bridge of Oakhaven vanished into a thick, grey fog behind her within seconds. Sarah sat perfectly still in the center of the boat, her knuckles white as she gripped the wooden edges. She remembered Silas's warning, "Do not look into the water." But the temptation was a physical weight. The river began to whisper. It wasn't a single voice, but a chorus of them, hushed conversations, laughter from long-forgotten summers, and the sharp, sudden cries of old grief. She felt the urge to lean over the side, to see the faces attached to those sounds. Intent. She whispered to herself, her eyes fixed on the silver compass in her lap. My intent is to find Thomas. My intent is to save the shop. The fog around her began to glow with a sickly, bruised light. The purple trees of Oakhaven were gone, replaced by tall, skeletal shapes that looked like frozen lightning. The sky above was not black, nor was it blue. It was the color of a faded bruise, swirling with slow, oily clouds. As the skiff rounded a sharp bend, the water finally began to slow. The fog parted, and Sarah saw it. Under Blackwood. It was a perfect, harrowing mirror of her village. The clock tower stood in the distance, but it was cracked, with thick, black vines growing from the clock face like veins. The houses were there, but they looked thin, like they were made of paper and could blow away with a single breath. There were no lights in the windows, only a flickering, cold grey glow that seemed to come from the ground itself. The skiff bumped gently against a wooden dock. It was the same dock where the village fishermen usually tied their boats. But here, the wood was bleached white like bone. Sarah stood up, her legs shaking. She took the phial of liquid starlight out of her bag. The silvery liquid was pulsing violently now, reacting to the proximity of the rift's core. She stepped onto the dock. The ground felt wrong, too soft, like walking on a layer of moss over a deep pit. The silence here was heavy, pressing against her ears until they began to ring. She pulled her coat tighter, but the cold here didn't come from the air, it came from within. "Thomas!" She called out. Her voice didn't carry. It fell flat, as if the air itself was eating the sound. She walked toward the village square. In the real Blackwood, this walk would take 5 minutes. Here, the street seemed to stretch and warp. The bookstore was visible at the end of the road, but it was surrounded by a swirling vortex of shadow. This was the source of the leak Silas had described. Suddenly, the silver compass in her pocket let out a sharp, metallic ping. The needle, which had been spinning, snapped toward the clock tower. Sarah looked up. High in the belfry, where the fire bell should have been, she saw a light. It wasn't the cold glow of the under Blackwood. It was a warm, flickering amber, the light of a kerosene lamp. Thomas is there, she realized. But as she moved toward the tower, the shadows in the bookstore's doorway began to detach themselves from the building. They weren't just shapes anymore. They were tall, faceless figures draped in the tatters of old memories. The others had sensed her. Sarah stood frozen as the faceless figures drifted away from the bookstore. They didn't walk, they glided, their tattered forms trailing like smoke in a breeze that didn't exist. These were the others, the manifestations of the village's forgotten sorrows and the restless energy of the rift. As they drew closer, the ringing in Sarah's ears intensified, transforming into a cacophony of hushed voices. They weren't speaking to her, they were whispering to each other about her. Their words a chilling blur of stranger, anchor, and thief. She remembered Silas's words. Your memory and your intent will be your only maps. She reached into her bag and pulled out the phial of liquid starlight. The silvery fluid was churning now, throwing off sparks of white light that cut through the oppressive grey gloom of the square. As she held it aloft, the shadows recoiled, their formless heads tilting away from the brilliance. A path opened before her, the ground beneath the light turning from soft, mossy rock back into the familiar, solid cobblestones of Blackwood. I am not a thief, Sarah said aloud, her voice sounding strange and resonant in the thin air. I am the keeper of the Thorn Bookstore. I am here for Thomas. She began to walk. With every step, the whispers grew louder, trying to pull at her mind. She felt flashes of emotions that weren't hers, the bitterness of a failed harvest from 1890, the grief of a widow in 1945, the secret shame of a mayor long dead. The under Blackwood was a reservoir of everything the village had tried to bury. If she lost focus for even a moment, she knew she would be swept away by the current of collective regret. She kept her eyes on the amber light in the clock tower. It was the only warm thing in this cold, monochrome world. As she reached the center of the square, she saw the fountain. In the real world, it was a peaceful stone basin. Here, it was a jagged maw of black glass, overflowing with a thick, ink-like substance that hissed as it touched the light of her phial. Suddenly, one of the shadows lunged. It wasn't a physical attack, but a mental one. Sarah felt a sudden, crushing wave of doubt. Why are you doing this? The shadow seemed to hiss into her mind. You could have stayed in the city. You could have had a normal life. You are going to die in the dark for a man you barely knew. Sarah stumbled, the phial dipping low. The silver light flickered. The cobblestones began to soften back into the treacherous moss. No, she gasped, forcing her eyes open. She thought of the smell of the bookstore, the peppermint tea and old paper. She thought of the look on Mrs. Gable's face when the fire bell rang. I chose this. I chose this place. She uncorked the phial and let a single drop of the liquid starlight fall onto the ground. The reaction was instantaneous. A ripple of pure, white energy surged outward, shattering the shadow figure into 1,000 harmless shards of mist. The path to the clock tower cleared, the heavy iron doors at the base standing ajar. Sarah ran. She didn't look back at the bookstore or the fountain. She reached the doors and ducked inside, pulling them shut behind her. The interior of the tower was a skeleton of rusted gears and rotting timber. But the amber light was closer now, shining down from the very top of the spiral staircase. She began to climb, each wooden step groaning under her weight. The air here was warmer, and the whispers of the square were replaced by the steady, mechanical tick-tock of a heart made of brass. The spiral staircase felt endless, a skeletal spine of rotted oak and rusted iron that groaned with every step Sarah took. The higher she climbed, the more the mechanical tick-tock felt like a physical pulse, vibrating through her boots and into her very bones. Finally, she reached the top landing. The belfry was open to the bruised, swirling sky of the under Blackwood. But instead of a bell, the space was dominated by a massive, intricate system of brass gears and silver pendulums. In the center of this mechanical forest sat a man. He was hunched over a workbench, his fingers dancing over a series of delicate springs. The amber light Sarah had seen came from a single, old-fashioned hurricane lantern hanging from a low beam. The man's clothes were tattered, his beard long and shot through with grey, but when he turned around, Sarah recognized the sharp, intelligent eyes from the photographs. Thomas. She whispered, the name catching in her throat. Thomas Thorn didn't stand up. He looked at her with a mixture of awe and profound sadness. His skin was pale, almost translucent in the lantern light, as if the under Blackwood was slowly erasing him. You shouldn't be here. Sarah. I left the shop to you so you could have a life, not so you could follow me into the grave of a village. The village isn't a grave yet, Sarah said, stepping into the circle of amber light. She felt the cold of the shadows recede, pushed back by the warmth of the lantern. But the mayor moved the gold. The anchor is gone. Silas told me the rift is opening. Thomas sighed, a sound like dry parchment rubbing together. He gestured to the gears behind him. I know. I can feel it in the clockwork. This tower is the frequency regulator. In this reflection, the clock doesn't measure minutes. It measures the stability of the barrier. Every time the pendulum swings, it stitches the rift just a little bit more. But I'm running out of oil for the lantern, and the gears are clogged with the dust of old memories. Sarah walked to the workbench. She saw the celestial map he had been working on. It was a twin to the one she carried. Silas sent me. I have the liquid starlight. And I have the silver key. Thomas's eyes brightened for a moment. The starlight. Yes, that might lubricate the main drive. But the key isn't for a lock. Sarah. It's a winding tool. The barrier needs a true anchor. Something that isn't just physical gold, but a conscious choice. The Black family used the gold because they had no soul to offer. They used a bribe to keep the dark away. Suddenly, the tower shuddered. From the darkness below, a long, low howl rose up, a sound of 1,000 voices screaming in unison. The shadows Sarah had seen in the square were no longer content to watch from a distance. They were climbing. They know you brought the starlight. Thomas said, his voice urgent. He stood up, his legs shaking. They want the light because it's the only thing that can burn through the barrier and let them into the real Blackwood. We have to finish the ritual of the true anchor now, or the tower will fall. Sarah looked at the massive gears. They were slowing down, the silver pendulums swinging in shorter and shorter arcs. Tell me what to do. The liquid. Thomas pointed to a small glass funnel at the heart of the machine. Pour it into the core. But you must hold the silver key against the main spring. You have to be the conduit. Sarah. You have to connect the memory of the bookstore to the heart of the tower. The sound from below was no longer just a howl. It was a rhythmic thumping, like a massive heart beating against the stone of the tower. The shadows were no longer gliding. They were clambering over one another, a tide of ink-black regret rising through the center of the spiral staircase. Sarah could see the flicker of their faceless heads just below the floorboards of the belfry. Hurry! Thomas urged, gesturing to the central brass funnel. His hands were translucent now, the amber light of the lantern passing right through his fingers. He was fading, his essence spent on keeping the pendulum swinging for so long. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out the phial of liquid starlight. The silvery fluid was more than just light. It was warm, almost vibrating with the collective hopes of Oakhaven and the ancestors of the Thorn line. She moved toward the core of the machine, where a massive, coiled spring of dark metal, the main spring, sat under immense tension. She took the silver key from her pocket. The star-shaped teeth of the key hummed as she brought it close to the spring. This wasn't just a key for the bookstore vault anymore. It was the interface between the human world and the machinery of the rift. I have to connect the memory of the bookstore. Sarah whispered, repeating Thomas's instructions. She closed her eyes for a second, conjuring the scent of old leather, the sound of the rain against the shop windows, and the feeling of a heavy book in her hands. She thought of the people she had met. Mrs. Gable's stern kindness, even Mr. Miller's tragic greed. She offered it all as an anchor. She jammed the silver key into the winding slot at the center of the spring. It resisted, the metal screaming as it fought her. At the same time, she uncorked the phial and began to pour the liquid starlight into the funnel. The effect was instantaneous. As the silvery liquid touched the brass gears, the grinding friction vanished, replaced by a smooth, celestial whirring. But the shadows had reached the landing. The first of the faceless figures surged over the edge, reaching out with cold, wispy fingers to extinguish the lantern. "Don't let go!" Thomas cried, throwing himself in front of the shadow. He didn't have a physical body to fight with, but his spirit flared with a sudden, bright amber light, momentarily blinding the entities. Sarah felt a surge of energy travel up her arm from the key. It wasn't painful, but it was overwhelming, a flood of images and sounds from Blackwood's history. She saw the first stone being laid for the church. She saw the fire of 1920, not as a tragedy, but as a violent burst of purple light. She saw herself, months ago, deciding to leave her life in the city. "I am the keeper," she shouted, twisting the key with every ounce of strength she possessed. The main spring began to wind, tighter and tighter. The silver pendulums, which had been sluggish, suddenly snapped into a wide, powerful arc. A pulse of white light erupted from the belfry, expanding outward like a shockwave. It hit the rising tide of shadows, and for a moment, the screams of the others were drowned out by the triumphant chime of the clock. The tower groaned, the ancient stones shifting. Sarah felt the ground fall away. For a terrifying moment, she was suspended in the air, the silver key the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. Then, the amber light of the lantern merged with the white light of the starlight, and everything went white. The white light did not fade so much as it dissolved, peeling away in layers like old wallpaper to reveal the world Sarah knew. She felt the hard, familiar grain of the bookstore's oak floorboards against her cheek. The air no longer smelled of ozone and ancient dust. It smelled of lavender, old leather, and the faint, lingering scent of peppermint tea. Sarah sat up slowly, her head spinning. She was back in the main room of the Thorn bookstore. The morning sun was streaming through the newly replaced front windows, casting long, peaceful diamonds of light across the room. The chaos of the night before, the broken glass, the mayor's threats, the shadows, seemed like a fever dream. But as she looked down at her hand, she knew it was real. The silver key was no longer just a piece of metal. It had taken on a pearlescent sheen, and when she touched it, a faint, rhythmic hum resonated through her fingers, mimicking the beat of the clock tower's heart. It was warm, a permanent anchor to the ritual she had just completed. She looked toward the center of the shop. The massive oak counter had returned to its original position, hiding the vault once more. But on top of the counter, where there had been nothing before, sat a single, perfectly preserved bluebell. Beside it was a small, handwritten note in Thomas's neat script. "The shop is yours now. Sarah, you are the heartbeat. The balance is held, but remember, the ink never truly dries." Sarah felt a lump in her throat. She ran to the back room and checked the trapdoor. It was sealed tight, the wood looking older and stronger than it ever had. She called out for Thomas, but there was no answer. He had stayed behind, or perhaps he had become part of the very machinery that kept the world safe. He was the sentinel in the reflection, and she was the warden in the light. She walked to the front door and turned the lock. A small crowd had gathered in the square, talking in hushed, urgent tones. When they saw her, the talking stopped. Mrs. Gable was there, along with the two police officers. They looked at Sarah with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. "Is it over?" Mrs. Gable asked, stepping forward. She looked at Sarah's clothes, torn, covered in grey dust that didn't seem to belong to this world. "The mayor is gone," Sarah said, her voice steady. "The gold is at the town hall. But the bookstore needs to stay exactly as it is. It's not just a shop. It's the weight that holds Blackwood together." The villagers didn't fully understand, but they saw the change in her. The new girl was gone. In her place stood someone who carried the weight of a century on her shoulders. Sarah spent the rest of the day cleaning. She didn't use a broom. She used the key. Every time she touched a shelf, the books seemed to align themselves, their spines glowing with a brief, faint light. She realized that Silas was right. The stories were the weight. She began to organize them not by author, but by intent, hope, tragedy, courage, and memory. As evening fell, Sarah sat behind the counter. The silver compass on the desk pointed steady and true. no longer spinning. But as she opened the 1920 ledger to record the day's events, she noticed a new page at the very back. It wasn't written in her hand or Thomas's. The ink was a shimmering purple, and it described a place Sarah had never heard of. The Whispering Library of the North. The mystery of the gold was solved, but the ledger was far from full. The rift had been sealed, but the world was much larger and louder than she had ever imagined. The morning sun over Blackwood was crisp, but inside the bookstore, the air felt thick with the weight of the new responsibility. Sarah sat at the mahogany counter, her fingers tracing the shimmering purple script at the back of the 1920 ledger. The ink seemed to have a life of its own. In the shadow, it was a deep violet, but when the light hit it, it glowed with a faint, iridescent pulse. The Whispering Library of the North. She whispered. The words felt cold on her tongue. She had spent the early hours researching every map in the shop, but the Whispering Library appeared in no geography books. It wasn't a place on a map. It was a place in the margins. According to the ledger's new entries, the Thorn bookstore was only one of 7 anchor points scattered across the continent. Blackwood held the anchor of memory, but the North held the anchor of silence. A chime at the front door startled her. It wasn't the heavy, familiar clatter of a villager. It was a delicate, melodic ring, like glass hitting silver. A woman stepped into the shop. She was tall, wrapped in a coat of grey fur that seemed to shed actual snowflakes despite the mild weather outside. Her eyes were an unsettling shade of violet, nearly matching the ink in the ledger. She didn't look at the shelves. She looked directly at the silver key resting on the counter. The woman approached the counter with a grace that felt predatory yet scholarly. She placed a small, wooden cylinder on the oak surface. "The seal is tight," the woman said, her voice sounding like ice cracking on a lake. "But the resonance is loud. You've caused quite a stir in the network." "Sarah Thorne." "I'm Sarah," she corrected, her hand instinctively moving toward the key. "And the shop is closed for inventory. I am Ilara, a binder from the North." The stranger continued, ignoring the dismissal. "We felt the pulse when you wound the main spring. You didn't just save a village. You alerted the siphoners that a new warden has been crowned. And unlike Thomas, you are untrained." Ilara opened the wooden cylinder. Inside was a scroll made of translucent parchment. When she unfurled it, Sarah saw a diagram of the 7 anchor points. Blackwood, the anchor of memory. Active, Oak Haven, the gatekeeper's lodge. Stable, the Frost Peaks, the Whispering Library. Disturbed, the Iron Coast, the Sunken Archive. Silent, the Whispering Library is screaming. Ilara said, pointing to the Frost Peaks. "The energy you released to close the Blackwood rift had to go somewhere. It traveled north, and now the silence is breaking. If the Whispering Library falls, the others you saw in the reflection won't just have a doorway, they'll have a highway." Sarah felt a surge of indignation. "I did what I had to do to save this place. I didn't know there were others. That is the burden of the key." Ilara replied. She reached out, not for the key, but for Sarah's hand. Her touch was freezing. "You are the heartbeat of Blackwood now. But a heart cannot beat in a vacuum. You must learn to listen to the ink. If the ledger is writing in purple, it means the etheric ink is bleeding. It's a warning. Sarah, the North is calling for its warden, but he hasn't answered in a century." Sarah looked at the purple script. It was moving, the letters rearranging themselves into a date. December 21st. The winter solstice. "What happens then?" Sarah asked. "The sun stands still," Ilara whispered, "and the barriers between the libraries become thin enough to walk through. You have 3 weeks to find the North's warden, or you'll have to go there yourself and face the silence." The lesson began not with sight, but with sound. Ilara insisted on closing the heavy velvet curtains of the bookstore, plunging the room into a deep, artificial twilight. Only the 1920 ledger remained illuminated, glowing with that unsettling, rhythmic purple light. "You see with your eyes, Sarah, and that is your first mistake," Ilara said, her voice echoing strangely through the stacks. "A warden must perceive the resonance. Every word ever written in etheric ink carries the weight of the hand that wrote it and the soul of the thought that birthed it. You aren't reading a story, you are listening to an echo." Ilara placed Sarah's hand an inch above the shimmering purple script. "Don't touch it yet. Feel the temperature. The north is cold, so the ink from the Whispering Library will feel like a frostbite on your consciousness. Tell me what you hear." At first, Sarah heard nothing but her own heartbeat. But as she relaxed her shoulders and cleared her mind of the day's anxieties, a low hum began to vibrate through the air. It wasn't a single tone, it was a discordant mess of thousands of whispers, all overlapping. It sounded like a crowded room where everyone was speaking at once. But no one was listening. It's chaotic," Sarah whispered, her brow furrowing. "Like a hive of bees. But the bees are made of glass. That is the silence breaking," Ilara explained. "In the north, the library is supposed to absorb the world's unnecessary noise, the secrets better left forgotten, the prayers that were never meant to be answered. Now, that noise is leaking back out. The siphoners, the entities that feed on the energy of the anchors, are using that noise to locate the library's heart." Sarah focused harder. She pushed her senses past the static, searching for a pattern. Suddenly, the chaotic whispers coalesced into a single, sharp image in her mind: a mountain peak covered in blue ice, and a door made of solid bone that was beginning to crack. "The bone door," Sarah gasped, pulling her hand away. Her fingertips were tipped with a faint frost. "It's breaking. Something is pounding on it from the inside." "That is the North's warden," Ilara said, her violet eyes flashing with a grim satisfaction. "Or what's left of him. He has been sealed inside the silence for 99 years. He was the one who was supposed to balance the fire of 1920. But the Black family's greed cut his connection to the network. He's not trying to get out. He's trying to keep something else from getting in." Sarah looked at the silver key on the counter. It was pulsing in sync with the purple ink. She realized that her training wasn't just about learning a craft. It was a preparation for a rescue mission. "Why me, Ilara?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "If the North is so dangerous, why don't the other binders go?" "Because we are the keepers of the law, not the keepers of the keys," Ilara replied coldly. "Only a warden can cross the threshold of another library without being consumed by the vacuum of its missing anchor. You are the only bridge left." Ilara reached into her fur coat and pulled out a small iron nib, a pen tip that glowed with a dull red light. "Now, you must learn to write back. If you can send a message through the ledger, you might give the North's warden enough strength to hold the door until the solstice." Sarah looked at the iron nib in Ilara's hand. It wasn't the polished silver of a modern fountain pen. It was pitted, dark, and thrummed with a dull red heat that felt like a dying coal. "I don't have any ink," Sarah noted, her voice barely a whisper in the heavy silence of the bookstore. "You are the ink, Sarah," Ilara replied, her violet eyes unblinking. "Etheric writing doesn't use pigment. It uses the blood of the story, your memories, your vitality, and your focused will. To write to the North, you must give up a piece of your own warmth." Ilara gestured to the 1920 ledger. The purple script from the Whispering Library was still swirling, forming patterns that looked like fractured ice. "Hold the nib. Do not think of letters or words. Think of the feeling of a fire in a hearth. Think of the sun hitting the bookstore's floor. Project that heat into the iron." Sarah reached out and grasped the nib. It was searingly hot, yet it didn't burn her skin. Instead, the heat seemed to bypass her nerves and strike straight at her mind. She gasped, her knees buckling. Suddenly, the bookstore vanished. She wasn't standing in Blackwood anymore. She was adrift in a void of grey static, the same silence she had heard earlier. "Right," Ilara's voice commanded from somewhere far away. Sarah pressed the nib to the ledger. She didn't move her hand to form letters. She simply poured her memory of a warm July afternoon into the metal. She felt a sudden, sharp drain, a sensation like a cold needle drawing fluid from her chest. Her breath hitched, and a thin, glowing line of golden ink began to spill from the nib, cutting through the purple frost on the page. "I am here. The anchor of memory holds," she thought. The golden ink didn't sit on the surface of the paper. It sank in, chasing the purple lines like a predator. As the two inks met, a plume of steam rose from the ledger, smelling of ozone and pine. The book shuddered, and for a brief second, Sarah felt a connection. On the other side of that connection, she felt a mind. It was vast, cold, and desperately tired. It was like touching a mountain that had been forgotten by the sun. "Sarah." A voice echoed back. It wasn't a sound, but a vibration in her teeth. "Solstice, the bone door, cannot hold." The name Julian flickered on the page in a pale, dying blue. Suddenly, the red heat of the nib turned into an icy chill. The golden ink Sarah was writing began to turn black at the edges. Ilara grabbed Sarah's wrist and yanked the pen away. Sarah collapsed onto the floor, her skin pale and her breath coming in white puffs of frost. "He felt you," Ilara said, her voice unusually soft. She looked down at the ledger. The name Julian was fading, but beneath it, a new map was beginning to etch itself into the leather. It wasn't a map of the north, but a map of the bookstore's own basement, showing a door that hadn't been there before. The siphoners intercepted the end of the message. Ilara warned, her face hardening again. "They know you're the one feeding the north. They'll be coming to the bookstore tonight, not through the front door, but through the gaps in the story. We have to prepare the paper shields before the sun sets." Sarah rubbed her cold arms, the golden memory of that July afternoon now feeling dull and distant. She had given it away to save a man she had never met, and in return, the darkness now had her scent. The sun dipped below the jagged horizon of the Blackwood Valley, casting long, bruised shadows across the bookstore floor. As the light died, the atmosphere in the shop shifted. The air grew thin and tasted of dry parchment and static. Ilara didn't waste a second. She began pulling specific volumes from the shelves, not by title, but by the weight of their presence. "The siphoners are voids, Sarah," Ilara explained, her hands moving with frantic precision. "They have no stories of their own, so they consume the narratives of others to maintain a physical form. To them, this bookstore is a banquet, but we will make it a cage." She instructed Sarah to arrange the selected books in a perfect circle around the 1920 ledger. These were the paper shields. These weren't ordinary novels. They were origin texts, first editions and handwritten journals that carried a high concentration of human intent. "Open them to the middle," Ilara commanded. "The heart of a story is its strongest point. We need the conflict, the climax, and the resolution to form a continuous loop of energy. When the siphoners try to enter the gaps, the moments of silence between the words, they will be caught in the narrative cycle." Sarah knelt, her fingers trembling as she opened a thick volume of local folklore. As she did, she felt the resonance she had learned earlier. The words on the page didn't stay flat. They seemed to vibrate, lifting slightly off the paper. A faint, golden light began to bridge the gap between each book in the circle, creating a shimmering dome of script that smelled of old ink and stormy weather. Suddenly, the front windows of the shop didn't break. They faded. The glass became translucent, then smoky, and finally, it dissolved into a grey mist. Out of the mist stepped the siphoners. They were taller than the others Sarah had seen in the Blackwood. Their bodies composed of swirling grey smoke that looked like shredded paper. They had no eyes, only jagged horizontal slits where mouths should be, and they moved with a jerky, stop-motion gait. One siphoner reached out a long, wispy finger toward a shelf of poetry. As its touch neared the wood, the color began to drain from the book spines, turning them to ash. "The shields!" Ilara hissed, her own iron nib glowing a violent red. "Sarah, you must read. Give the shield its voice." Sarah scrambled to the center of the circle. She looked at the open books. "Which one?" "All of them. Find the thread." Sarah took a deep breath and began to read aloud from the folklore book. And the giant of the mountain found that his strength was not in his stone, but in his memory of the valley. As she spoke, the golden light of the dome intensified. She jumped to the next book, a collection of wartime letters. "I am writing this by the light of a single candle, knowing that as long as this ink dries, I am still home." The siphoners shrieked. They lunged at the dome, but the words Sarah spoke became physical barriers. The golden script swirled faster, forming a wall of shimmering sentences that repelled the grey smoke. However, the strain was immense. Sarah felt that same cold needle from earlier, drawing on her vitality to power the words. Her voice grew hoarse, and the edges of her vision began to blur. One siphoner, larger and darker than the rest, pressed its face against the shield. Its mouth opened, and it began to write the words Sarah was saying, mimicking her voice in a distorted, backwards echo. "It's eating the story." Sarah cried, her voice cracking. "Then change the ending." Ilara shouted, her violet eyes glowing. "Don't just read the book, Sarah. Become the author." Sarah's voice was failing, the air in the bookstore turning into a dry, choking dust as the lead siphoner inhaled the golden script. Every word she read was being erased before it could reach the barrier. The dome of light flickered, the edges of the paper shields curling and turning black as if scorched by an invisible flame. I can't keep up with the silence." Sarah gasped, her knees hitting the floor. "Stop reading the past." Ilara's voice was a whip crack over the screeching of the shadows. "The siphoners know those stories. They've tasted them for centuries. Give them something new. Give them the story of this moment." Sarah looked at the silver key in her hand. It was vibrating so violently it blurred. She realized that the key wasn't just a winding tool for the clock. It was a stylus. She reached out and grabbed the iron nib from Ilara, ignoring the searing heat that traveled up her arm. She didn't press the nib to the ledger. Instead, she thrust it into the air, right into the swirling golden energy of the dome. "This isn't the story of a giant or a soldier," Sarah shouted, her voice suddenly resonant and clear, booming from her chest instead of her throat. "This is the story of Sarah Thorne. This is the story of a woman who was lost and found a home in the cracks of a secret. This is the story of the now." She began to move the nib in the air, drawing glowing lines of white fire that ignored the origin texts on the floor. She began to narrate her own life, the smell of the rain on the day she arrived, the weight of the red diary, the cold fear of the church basement, and the warmth of the tea Mrs. Gable had given her. As she spoke her truth, the golden dome transformed. It was no longer a static shield. It became a living, breathing tapestry. The siphoners recoiled. They couldn't write this story because it was happening in real time. It was fresh, raw, and filled with a vitality they couldn't digest. "The truth is the poison," Ilara cried, her eyes wide with shock. "You're feeding them being, and they are made of nothing." The lead siphoner let out a final wail as the white fire of Sarah's narrative touched its smoky form. It didn't shatter, it simply evaporated, its grey essence neutralized by the sheer density of Sarah's presence. The others followed, dissolving into a fine mist that smelled of old library paste and fresh rain. The bookstore fell into a sudden, heavy silence. The grey mist outside the windows cleared, revealing the quiet, moonlit streets of Blackwood once more. Sarah collapsed, the iron nib falling from her blistered fingers. The golden light faded, leaving only the soft, purple glow of the ledger. Ilara walked to her, helping her sit up. For the first time, there was a flicker of genuine respect in the binder's violet eyes. You didn't just defend the shop, Sarah. You became an active author. You've anchored this moment so deeply that the siphoners won't be able to touch this library for a generation. But Sarah wasn't looking at Ilara. She was looking at the floorboards near the back of the shop. During the battle, the energy had stripped away the glamour of the old building. A section of the floor had shifted, revealing a narrow, stone staircase that led straight down. Not into the basement she knew, but into a tunnel lined with frost. "The path to the north," Sarah whispered, her breath hitching. "It's open." "The solstice is in 3 days," Ilara said, looking at the freezing stairs. "Julian is waiting. And now, you finally have the ink to reach him." The air rising from the new staircase was so cold it felt sharp, like inhaling powdered glass. Sarah looked at the steps, which were carved from a translucent blue stone that seemed to glow with an inner, frozen light. This wasn't a basement. It was a geographical anomaly, a bridge through the etheric weave that connected the anchor of memory to the anchor of silence. "Once we step onto those stairs, the bookstore will be miles away in a matter of seconds," Ilara warned, pulling her grey fur coat tighter. "The frost path doesn't measure distance in meters. It measures it in the silence between thoughts. Stay focused on Julian. If your mind wanders to the warmth of the village, the path will stretch until you freeze in the transition." Sarah nodded, clutching the silver key. She stepped onto the first stone. The transition was instantaneous. The smell of old books and peppermint vanished, replaced by the scent of ancient ice and absolute stillness. The walls of the tunnel were not made of dirt or brick, but of millions of frozen bubbles, each containing a tiny, trapped sound, a bird's chirp, a child's laugh, a distant bell. "These are the sounds the whispering library couldn't process," Ilara whispered, her breath forming a thick cloud. "When the anchor broke, the library began to exhale its contents. If these bubbles pop, the noise will be deafening." As they descended deeper, the temperature plummeted. Sarah's boots crunched on a floor of solid frost. Suddenly, the tunnel widened into a vast, underground cavern. In the center of the cavern stood a figure made entirely of frost. It didn't have a face, but it wore a tattered cloak that Sarah recognized from her visions. "Is that Julian?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling from the cold. "It's a memory echo," Ilara replied. "It's the part of Julian that he had to cast off to keep his mind sharp behind the bone door. It's a ghost of his warmth." The echo turned toward them. It raised a frozen hand, pointing toward a massive, shimmering curtain of aurora light at the far end of the cavern. As it did, a sound escaped it, a low, mournful vibration that caused the sound bubbles in the walls to rattle dangerously. "The clock is backwards." The echo vibrated. "He's losing his sense of time," Sarah realized. "The solstice isn't in 3 days. In the north, the solstice is already happening." Sarah ran toward the aurora curtain, the silver key acting as a compass, pulling her forward. As she passed the memory echo, she reached out and touched its hand. For a split second, she shared Julian's burden, the crushing weight of 1,000 years of secrets pressing against a door that was slowly splintering. She didn't pull away. She offered a spark of her own active ink, the golden heat she had used against the siphoners. The echo solidified for a moment, its frost turning to a pale gold. It nodded, and the aurora curtain parted like silk. Sarah and Ilara stepped through and found themselves standing on a jagged ledge of blue ice. Above them, the sky was a swirling vortex of purple and green. Below them, nestled in a valley of white marble, was the Whispering Library of the North. It was a massive, circular structure made of whalebone and silver, but the great bone doors at the entrance were covered in deep, jagged cracks that pulsed with a dark, rhythmic shadow. "We're here," Ilara said, her voice tight with fear. "But look at the gates. The silence isn't leaking out anymore. Something is trying to force its way in." The descent from the ice ledge was a treacherous scramble down a slope of slick marble and frozen shale. Below them, the Whispering Library loomed, a gargantuan, rib-cage structure of ancient whalebone, polished to a mirror-like sheen. It looked less like a building and more like a gargantuan skeletal heart, beating with a slow, rhythmic violet light. But the light was being choked. A mass of absolute darkness, darker than the void of the under Blackwood, was coiled around the entrance. It looked like a storm of black static, a void eater. It didn't have a shape so much as it had an appetite. Everywhere it touched the silver-inlaid bone, the structure began to dissolve into grey ash. The cracks in the door weren't just physical breaks. They were wounds in the concept of silence itself. "That is the source," Ilara shouted over the rising wind, which sounded like the screaming of 1,000 torn pages. "The siphoners in the bookstore were just the scouting party. This thing is the original void. It wants to consume the anchor of silence so it can erase the world's history from the north down." Sarah reached the base of the great bone gate. The heat from her active ink was the only thing keeping her from freezing solid. Up close, the gate was inscribed with thousands of tiny, silver runes, every name of every person who had ever died in the north. Their stories kept in the silence to prevent them from becoming ghosts. "The key, Sarah," Ilara urged, her violet eyes wide with terror as the Void Eater lunged, a tentacle of static whipping toward them. "The silver key from Blackwood is the winding rod for the northern clock. Memory must win the silence, or the silence will simply stop." Sarah didn't hesitate. She dodged the lash of black static, her boots sliding on the marble. She saw a small, star-shaped depression in the center of the bone doors, the exact match for the key she had used in the bookstore and the clock tower. But the hole was filled with purple frost. "Julian!" Sarah screamed, pressing her hand against the bone. "I'm here. Open the path." From behind the massive doors, a voice finally answered. It was no longer a vibration or a whisper. It was a clear, ringing tone that sounded like a silver bell struck in a vacuum. "The key is the bridge, Sarah, but the static, it eats the intention." Sarah felt the Void Eater close in. The temperature dropped even further, the air turning into a liquid cold that threatened to stop her heart. She realized she couldn't just insert the key. She had to author its path. She gripped the silver key with both hands, imagining the warmth of the Blackwood forge where it was first made. She poured her memory of the sun rising over her bookstore into the metal. The key began to glow with a fierce, white-gold light that hissed as it touched the purple frost. With a roar of defiance, Sarah jammed the key into the center of the bone gate. The Void Eater shrieked. The silver runes on the door flared into blinding life. The cracks began to seal, the bone knitting itself back together as the active ink of Sarah's memory filled the gaps. A heavy, mechanical clunk echoed through the valley. The doors didn't swing outward. They dissolved into a fine mist of silver snow. Standing in the threshold was a man who looked like he was made of starlight and shadows. His eyes were the color of the aurora, and his hands were stained with the same purple ink that filled the ledger. "Julian," Sarah gasped. "You're late," the Warden of Silence said, a tired but brilliant smile breaking across his face. "But just in time to help me finish the story." The interior of the Whispering Library was not a room of shelves and ladders, but a vast, inverted cathedral of ice. Floating crystals, each the size of a carriage, drifted through the air, their surfaces etched with the silent records, the thoughts and secrets the world was too loud to hold. At the center of this frozen void stood the anchor of silence, a pillar of pure, black obsidian that absorbed all light and sound. Julian, the Warden of the North, stepped toward Sarah. His presence was cold, yet it possessed a profound stability. "The Void Eater is not a beast, Sarah," he said. his voice echoing in her mind rather than her ears. It is the great unwritten. It is the hunger for the end of the story. It followed the resonance of your key because it wants to bridge the gap between memory and silence. If it consumes both, there will be no past to remember and no future to keep quiet. Outside, the static of the Void Eater slammed against the resealed bone gate. The library shuddered, and several of the floating crystals shattered, releasing a flurry of discordant whispers that swirled around them like a frantic blizzard. "We have to fuse the anchors," Julian continued, his aurora-colored eyes fixed on the silver key Sarah still held. "Memory gives the world weight, and silence gives it room to breathe. Separately, we are targets. Together, we are a closed circuit." "How?" Sarah asked, her breath hitching as a leak of black static began to seep through the ceiling of the ice cathedral. "The ritual of the dual script," Ilara intervened, stepping into the center of the room. She looked at Julian with a mixture of relief and professional sternness. "I am the binder. I will provide the structure, but you too must provide the narrative. Julian, you must offer the silence of the unseen. Sarah, you must offer the memory of the living. You must write a new chapter into the heart of the obsidian pillar." Sarah walked to the obsidian anchor. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff at night. She looked at Julian, who took his place on the opposite side of the pillar. He reached out his hand, and Sarah took it. The sensation was jarring, like fire and ice meeting in her veins. "Don't look at the void, Sarah," Julian whispered. "Look at the ink." Ilara began to chant in a language that sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. She raised her iron nib, and a web of violet threads erupted from her fingers, lacing Sarah and Julian together against the black stone. "Now!" Ilara cried. Sarah pressed her silver key against the obsidian, while Julian pressed his ink-stained fingers against the other side. Sarah began to pour every memory of Blackwood into the stone: the smell of the bookstore, the chime of the fire bell, the taste of the peppermint tea. Julian, in turn, poured the vast, peaceful emptiness of the north into the circuit. The obsidian pillar began to glow. It wasn't the purple of the north or the gold of Blackwood, but a brilliant, searing white. The static of the Void Eater, which had been tearing at the roof, was suddenly sucked toward the pillar. It wasn't consuming the library anymore. The library was digesting the void. The great unwritten was being forced into a story. "It's working!" Sarah shouted, though she felt her very identity being stretched thin. She was no longer just Sarah. She was the history of a village, the weight of 1,000 books, and the heartbeat of a secret. But the Void Eater fought back. One final, massive surge of static hit the pillar, threatening to shatter the connection between the wardens. Sarah felt her grip on the silver key slipping. Her memories were being pulled from her, the face of her mother, her life in the city, her own name, all of it drifting toward the black hole of the void. "Hold on." Julian's voice was a roar in her mind. "Don't let the story end." The obsidian pillar was no longer a cold stone. It was a hungry vortex, pulling the very essence of Sarah's life into its depths. She watched, horrified, as the memory of her first day at the bookstore flickered and turned to grey ash. Then went the memory of her father's laugh, and the sting of her first heartbreak. The Void Eater wasn't just attacking the library. It was erasing the author to ensure the story could never be told. "Sarah, focus on the choice, not the past." Julian's voice was strained, his starlight form flickering like a dying candle. "The void can take what was, but it cannot take what you do." Sarah realized then that she had been fighting with the wrong weapons. She had been trying to hold onto her history like a shield, but a shield can be broken. She needed to become the ink itself. She stopped trying to pull her memories back. Instead, she pushed them forward, offering them up as a sacrifice to fuel the final sentence of the ritual. "I am Sarah Thorne," she screamed into the white-hot roar of the pillar. "And I choose the ending." She gripped the silver key and, instead of just holding it against the stone, she began to carve. She didn't write her name or her past. She wrote a single, powerful command into the heart of the anchor. To be continued. It was the ultimate weapon against the Void Eater. The great unwritten thrived on endings, on the silence that follows a finished tale. By asserting that the story would never truly end, Sarah created a paradox that the static could not consume. The white light of the pillar erupted, no longer blinding but harmonious. The violet threads Alara had woven between Sarah and Julian turned into solid gold. The Void Eater's shrieks turned into a low, melodic hum as the black static was pulled into the obsidian. Not as a destroyer, but as the margins of a new book. The darkness was bound, turned into the very space between words that allowed the story to exist. The explosion of energy threw Sarah and Julian backward. Sarah hit the ice floor, the silver key falling from her hand. It was no longer glowing. It was now a deep, translucent sapphire, humming with the combined power of memory and silence. The silence that followed was not the terrifying vacuum of the north, but a peaceful, heavy quiet, the kind that follows a long day of hard work. The ice cathedral stopped shaking. The floating crystals settled into a slow, rhythmic orbit. Sarah looked up. The ceiling of the library, once cracked and leaking darkness, was now a perfect map of the stars, showing both the Blackwood constellations and the northern lights. Julian was kneeling a few feet away, his form solid once more. He looked younger, the weariness of a century replaced by a calm, steady light. "You did it," he whispered, looking at the obsidian pillar. It was now a pillar of white marble, etched with the names and stories of everyone the Void had tried to erase. "The anchors are fused. The network is stable." Ilara stood over them, her grey fur coat dusted with silver snow. She looked down at the sapphire key. "The price was high, Sarah. You gave up much of what you were to save what we are." Sarah looked inward. There were holes in her memory, faces she couldn't quite name, streets she didn't recognize. But when she looked at the key, and then at Julian, she didn't feel empty. She felt like a book that had just finished its first volume and was ready for the next. "I know who I am now," Sarah said, standing up on shaky legs. "I'm the warden. And it's time to go home." The transition from the Whispering Library to the Thorn Bookstore was as silent as a falling snowflake. One moment, Sarah was standing in an ice cathedral of whales and stars. The next, her boots touched the warm, worn floorboards of her shop. The smell of cold ozone vanished, replaced instantly by the comforting, earthy scent of old paper, lavender, and the faint, lingering sweetness of peppermint tea. The morning sun was pouring through the front windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny, golden scribes. Sarah stood still, her hand resting on the banister of the basement stairs. The stone steps behind her had reverted to ordinary wood. The path to the north was closed, but the connection, the steady, rhythmic hum in her chest, remained. She looked down at the sapphire key in her hand. It was cool and quiet now, but she could feel the resonance of the north within it, perfectly balanced against the memory of the village. Walking to the mahogany counter, Sarah saw the 1920 ledger. It was open to the very last page. The purple ink of the north and the golden ink of her memory had merged into a beautiful, iridescent script that seemed to shimmer with its own light. It didn't describe thefts or bribes anymore. It was a living record, a book of life that hummed with the stories of Blackwood and the silence of the Frost Peaks. A soft chime echoed as the front door opened. Mrs. Gable stepped inside, carrying a small plate of lemon cakes. She stopped, her eyes widening as she looked at Sarah. "You've been gone for 3 days, dear," Mrs. Gable said softly. She walked closer, her gaze moving to Sarah's face. "You look different. Older, somehow. And your eyes, they look like the stars over the valley." Sarah smiled, and though she realized she couldn't remember the name of the street she grew up on in the city, or the face of her first boss, she knew exactly who Mrs. Gable was. She knew the history of the chair the woman sat in and the origin of the flour used for the cakes. The active ink had replaced her personal past with the collective memory of the world she had chosen to save. "I went for a long walk, Mrs. Gable," Sarah said, her voice steady and warm. "I was finding a way to make sure this shop stays open forever." "Well," the librarian said, setting the cakes on the counter, "the village feels different today. Lighter. Like we all woke up from a long, heavy dream." After Mrs. Gable left, Sarah spent the afternoon shelving the new arrivals. She realized she no longer needed a catalogue. She could feel where every book belonged. The anchor of memory was fully restored, and the others were back in the margins where they belonged. She sat at her desk as the sun began to set, casting long, peaceful shadows across the room. She picked up a pen, a regular one this time, and began to write in the ledger. December 24th. The anchors are holding. Julian is watching the north, and I am watching the square. The story is no longer a secret. It is a promise. We are the keepers of the weight, and the weight is light. She closed the ledger and placed the sapphire key on top of it. She walked to the front door and flipped the sign to closed. As she looked out into the quiet, snow-dusted streets of Blackwood, she saw a flicker of purple light in the distance, near the old church. A message from Julian, perhaps, or just the aurora dancing in the reflection. Sarah breathed in the scent of her bookstore, her home. She wasn't just a stranger who had inherited a mystery. She was the author of the next volume. She reached up and switched off the main light. But the shop didn't go dark. The books themselves provided the glow, their spines shimmering with 1,000 stories that would never be forgotten. The mystery of the Thorn bookstore was over, but the history of the Wardens was only just beginning.